like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down into the forest, man. It's gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. There ain't nobody seeing nobody. Man, see, like, you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like that, man, the dust and wind, man. Or like a dang old candle, man. It don't matter, man. It's all the time anyway.
All right, gents, this is another compilation. The one that I did with Luthemplar talking about the three-body problem was well reviewed. But this is a collection of all my interviews with Z-Man, who is, I'm no doubt, reminding you, unfortunately passed earlier this year. This is coinciding with sort of a retrospective, sorry, my cat's attacking the blinds, that I did on Pete Quinones' show with Carl Dahl. That will be out soon, so be sure to check that out and hear, my thoughts on him sort of more at length. But nonetheless, let's get into it and go over every time I've spoken to Z-Man. All right, Z-Man, welcome to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing?
Good. Thank you for having me.
So I've been listening to your podcast for quite a while now, but for maybe some of my audience who aren't familiar with you, what do you do on the internet?
Well, about, 2013, I started my site, thezman.com, and it was largely an accident. I used to haunt the comment sections of various websites and just for my own entertainment. I wasn't, I kind of dropped out of politics in any serious way. I just looked at politics as entertainment. And I used to really like picking on the National Review writers. So I would do that. And one of their moderators actually said that, my comments get more attention than the articles I'm commenting on. And I did notice that I would comment something, I have 100 replies. He said, you should think about doing your own stuff, start a blog or something. And I thought, maybe that could be fun. So I owned the domain name, thezman.com, from the 1990s. I registered as a joke. Back then, when you got online, you were assigned a user ID, and I was always the Z-Man, some combination of the Z-Man. So when you could buy domains, I bought the domain just as a gag. I set up an email address and I hung on to it. And I figured, well, I'll use the domain. I have a server. I'll set up a WordPress site on it. So I'll put this all together, and it doesn't cost me anything. And if I don't, I get tired of it, I'll just abandon it. And if I like it, then I'll come up with some clever marketing. Well, one thing led to another, and I didn't do that. And it turned out to be actually a pretty good idea. It's kind of a weird brand, but it works. And so I was just doing sort of the old blogging type stuff, copy and paste and all that. And I started writing these short essays just because I was bored and I thought it would be fun to do. And I started getting an audience, and I started getting a bigger audience. And interesting people started turning up, like college professors turn up in my comment section or send me emails. And I started getting serious about it. And I went to a real world event, and all these people were coming up to me saying, "Oh man, I love your site. This essay on this." And it was shocking to me that I had an audience, and an audience willing to show up and meet me in public. So I decided to get serious about it. And the podcast, that was a total accident as well. Some Canadian radio guy was a reader, and he wanted to interview me. And I told him, look, I'd never done any internet audio. And he said, "Oh, I'll show you all the tricks. And, I'll give you that. And you give me a couple hours of your time." So I said, sure. And when it went up, people said, "Wow, you got a great voice for podcasting," which I didn't know there was such a thing. And the joke was I had a radio voice or NPR voice. That's what people say. I sound like somebody who should be on NPR. And people said you should do your own podcast. So I started fooling around with it. If you went back and listened to the early stuff, it's not very good. And but you try. You try different things. And then finally, I kind of settled on this format that I have, and it's fun. It's kind of a weird thing to do in that you sit down for an hour and a half or so and record by yourself, but it's you get used to it. And I enjoy it. I have fun with it. And I've got quite a listenership. It's hard to know what kind of listenership you have because the metrics are all crappy. But my readership, I got about, every month I get about 300,000 unique readers. So but the listenership is probably something like that. And, so it's become a nice thing. It's become a thing that I do. And it's a part of who I am. And I think the enjoyable part is that it's finding out that there are lots and lots of people who have similar concerns, similar outlook, And I think a similar commitment to try and avoid our society going over the cliff. We don't know what to do, but we do know something has to be done. And that's encouraging. It's a bit of a white pill.
And I think that that's what I've admired in your work is two things. One, you've mentioned that you've been around, you've been on the internet for a while. And so it adds perspective. Like, look, I'm a younger guy. I'm in my early 20s. The majority of my audience is similarly, Gen Z and millennials. And so having someone who has had the type of opinions that you and I had, for long enough to kind of see the patterns. I was talking with my wife about this. When you sort of see a storyline rerun, like, oh, wait a minute, I've seen the conservative Supreme Court judge, going up to get questioned in front of Congress. I've seen that story run before. It's not surprising to me. And once you get outside of that stream, you sort of gain a little bit of perspective on it. And, so listening to someone who has been around for a while is sort of, invaluable. And one of the things that you mentioned in an episode of your show I quite liked, called Robots and Retards, not the only episode I listened to, but a particular favorite, is that you talk about the changing corporate culture in America. So, you hear a lot of our guys talking about the competency crisis, right? We can no longer produce good people and stick them into jobs where they're useful. And look, like, I've never had a normal office job, right? Even now, my 9 to 5 is not a traditional job. But nonetheless, talking to people who are even just a little bit older than me, it's very clear that system has broken down. So what was the inciting incident for your kind of conversation about competency and IQ decline?
Yeah, I mean, I've probably the first time I wrote about this, I'm going to take some credit for the crisis of competence phrase. I think I may have been the first person to use it, or one of the first. And it was probably about 10 years ago. But I do a lot in my day job with all sorts of things. I work with a lot of complex systems. I do a lot of math for a living. And I work with complex systems, maybe computer systems, human systems, manufacturing systems. I've done a lot of work with global trade, currency exchanges. This is all stuff. It's not hard. It's just complicated. I've done work for the government with complex systems where, for example, there's different agencies in the government that issue grants, but there's a process in which the grants are issued and they're monitored and so forth. And they become almost Byzantine. I've worked on software projects to try and automate these things, and this is hard stuff in that it's very complicated. It has lots of things. And when you do that kind of work, you tend to be working with the 10% of the organization, that the top part, the right side of the bell curve. And over my lifetime, and I'm in my 50s, so last 30 years of working, I went from being in an environment where I was always unsure if I was good enough to being in environments often where I'm unsure if the people in the room with me are going to hold me back from completing the task. It's not that I've become a genius. It's because all the smart old guys are gone. And what's replaced them is not smart old guys or smart young guys. It's oftentimes people who are in these positions for reasons that have nothing to do with the position. And you see it all over the place. But at the same time, I've done a lot of work in the dreaded private sector with automation. And what the unwritten truth of automation is that we no longer have enough smart people to manage the smart fraction is shrinking. So if we can automate, the thought is if we can automate that smart fraction and augment it with software intelligence, we can overcome it. People don't say it that way, but it's pretty much what's happening. But it can't be done that way because first of all, we don't have this. AI is nothing like it's advertised, and our software intelligence can only enforce rules. That's really what it can do. So really what we're ending up with is a metastasizing set of rules to control a population that probably is not bright enough to be in the positions that we need in order to keep this very sophisticated machine of Western civilization running. And it's hard to see how it works. I think, I made the comparison that imagine a spaceship lands somewhere in I don't know, New Mexico, for example. and we get a hold of it and we try to figure it out. Well, this thing that's able to travel the stars is beyond the people who made it have knowledge that we don't know exists. In other words, they know things that we don't know you can know. That's how the gap is. We would never be able to unriddle it. We wouldn't even know where to start. And that's increasingly what's happening. We're replacing people who made the tools that they use, the baby boomer generation. We're replacing them with people who take the tools for granted, don't really understand how the tools work, and really probably would never be able to understand how the tools work. And at some point, the wheels are going to come off the cart in important ways. And this is not without precedent. And, there was a lot of knowledge lost with the collapse of Rome. There's knowledge that the Greeks had. We lost. It's still lost. Greek fire is a great example. And that may be what we're facing now, although it could be much more catastrophic because, you look at population numbers, the collapse of the Roman Empire, what was there, 50 million people in Europe at the time, something like that. When you're talking about civilizations with billions of people, it might be a little bit worse. But I think it's not a thing that can be addressed. It's just a thing that can be planned for. And I think there's no fixing the decline in IQ. And I think you interviewed Ed Dutton, right?
Yes, I have.
Yeah. I know Ed, and I have some good Ed stories. But he's a very funny guy. But he's written about this quite a bit. His book, At Our Wits' End, it's truthful, it's accurate, it's empirically correct, but it's very depressing. There's really nothing that can be done to arrest this decline in IQ. And most likely what nature will do is prune the human population considerably, leaving the smart fraction, or growing the smart fraction, relatively speaking. That's not good news, but that's probably what will happen. Because there isn't an answer, unless, of course, we have some incredible breakthrough technologically that essentially allows us to create a robot overlord to keep control of us. But I don't see that happening.
So one quick thing, just to anecdote about Dutton. They say, right, you need to be at least within one standard deviation of IQ of someone to have a conversation. And I know that Dutton is incredibly, incredibly intelligent because I felt like a child talking to an adult. I was just on the cusp. And so, I'm not exactly a genius, but I'm a relatively bright guy. I'm like, okay, Dutton is a real deal, like incredibly intelligent guy. It was, he was very patient with me. But one of the things that I want to...
Ed wanted me at once, thinks that people like me should be exterminated because of an outlier. I come from the underclass, and yet, I don't have any of the underclass attributes, so he thinks that kind of screws up the model. So I should have been snuffed out.
Should just eliminate an outlier to make the statistics nicer, right?
Yeah, exactly. It makes for a much more smoother curve.
But one of the things that I brought up talking to Ed, and this dovetails nicely with what you're talking about, is this idea of a bottleneck, right? And a friend of mine, Black Horse, has this idea of modernity as this genetic bottleneck. And he kind of draws an analogy to the Black Death in Europe, where roughly 30 to 40% of all bloodlines ceased to exist. It was sort of a checkpoint for your physical immune system. And sort of his thesis is that what we're seeing now is you're being tested for your resilience to a mental virus, right? A mental virus that basically tells you to produce no offspring, to castrate, what offspring you may have, and to let an infinite number of foreigners inside the gates of your society. And essentially the test is not falling for that, right? Being able to sort of resist that. And I think there's something to that, right? That effectively, and bloggers like Spandrel have written about the IQ shedder. One of the truly awful things about this situation is that we are taking what, that kind of smart fraction, right? That top, X% of the social pyramid, and putting them in a situation where it is low class, right? It is socially disadvantageous to reproduce, to have children, to do anything other than kind of throw yourself into this prestige hierarchy, and particularly for women, right? I have a friend of mine who's multi-generational Harvard, incredibly intelligent guy. And I was talking with him, and he's in his, if I had to guess, late 40s to early 50s. And he said that the TFR of his graduating class was 0.6. And
yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And that shows that this rot is not new, right? This didn't just happen in 2013, right? This is a problem that's been going on for a while. And so when you talk about kind of returning to the mean, I think that that's something I see as well in the future, right? That we have sort of lost the ability to support the nice things about our society, and so they will go away.
Yeah, I mean, the selection pressure against reproducing, I felt it when I came along in the 1980s. So that's 45 years ago now, something like that, 40 years ago. And, I was lucky in a way in that I got kind of plucked out of the slums went to a nice private schools. And, I got in, for test scores. So it was one of those things. I don't even know if they still do this now, but when I was a young guy, they used to experiment like crazy on public school children with IQ. And we got tested every year. We took all kinds of tests. And I used to get in trouble because I would score outside the range that was considered normal. And that's really what my interest in IQ tests started out of my youth. I got curious about these tests because, they would change them up, and you could tell that one were aiming at verbal intelligence, verbal dexterity, reasoning and stuff. And anyway, talk about that another time. But, we used to do this all the time. And that's pretty much how I wound up getting an opportunity to go to nice private schools, because people noticed that, hey, this guy's got something on the ball. He's not going to be a criminal like everybody else in his family. So, we can milk something out of him. And it used to be there was a point of pride in our society to try and do that. Colleges, elite colleges used to look for people in the lower classes or, that had something on the ball that could be made of something. It doesn't work that way anymore because the selection pressures have changed. But even when I was coming along, all of us as young people got lectures about, you don't want to get married and have children too soon. You want to build a career. You want to have adventures. You want to go see life. And my generation, the fertility rate was very low. Most of my friends did not have children. So, probably about 40% wound up having kids. And, normally it would be 60%, because about 40% of males don't reproduce, or at least they don't know they reproduced. But now it's probably much higher. Like for your generation, Zoomers, I mean, I had a conversation with someone last night about that. You guys have been raised up and born in a way that is very unique, and it's going to have very strange consequences. But yeah, I mean, getting back to your point is that this has been the pressure against having, traditional families and traditional life has been strong for a long time, and it has had an impact. You get the things that you select for, and somehow or other we created cultural forces that select against the things that are necessary to maintain the culture. We've become panda bears. I've used that example, the panda bear. We're getting to the point where we may not be able to, survive as a species without external help. And it's because it's not just getting married. I mean, sperm counts have collapsed. Testosterone levels have collapsed. I mean, there's other stuff going on here. It's more than just cultural pressures. I think there might be some environmental issues involved. One of the things that I've noticed, I ran into a study. I was doing some government work. I ran into this study about menopausal women coming down with all kinds of strange allergies. And it's a phenomena that's apparently been going on. And it became a big issue during COVID because a lot of these women who were 50s, 60s had horrible reactions to the COVID vaccines. And there's a one school of thought that says that, the baby boom generation is really the first generation to be raised on processed foods loaded with lots of chemicals that we think are safe, but no one's ever studied the long-term consequences. Well, that could be true of a lot of things. There might be lots of things in our life that have deleterious effects on us as a species that they're tested safe in the short term, they don't kill you, but maybe you shouldn't consume them for 40 years of your life, or maybe you shouldn't grow up on them. It has an impact. So I mean, there's a lot of different things going on here. But I think the bottleneck idea, it's not without precedent. Jewish IQ is probably the result of a bottleneck because you think about it when, like on the Black Death, it killed stupid people more than it killed smart people. And people recognized this at the time. They saw it at the time. They saw that they couldn't understand germ theory or anything else, but they knew that that the poor suffered more than the rich. And and it's probably true in COVID as well. Smart people probably had fewer problems with COVID than dumb people. And because there's a high correlation between intelligence and health outcomes. And this is probably why Ashkenazi IQ was high because there was a serious bottleneck. We know this from genetics. And so it left this founder population, it reformed the founder population around high IQ people. And so inbreeding, leads to an high IQ population. And maybe the same thing will happen to European people, although, Asian fertility has collapsed as well. So, it's not just a European people problem. I mean, even like East African populations are starting to decline. So, maybe maybe we don't realize it, but maybe Mother Nature is preparing a great reset for humanity. She's decided we've gone down a dead end and we need to have a course correction.
It's interesting you bring up that idea of the Great Reset, because earlier you mentioned AI. And I remember an article I read in The Atlantic during a brief period in my teen years where I was trying to be fair to liberals before I just learned to despise them. And it presented AI, and this was well before kind of consumer AI, quote unquote, products like DALL-E and the other LLMs, as this sort of like, silver bullet to solve all of the contradictions of America, right? To essentially manage out of existence the conflict between the welfare state, the warfare state, all of these things that were causing problems. And the idea is, we can't see a way out of this problem, but AI will. And I think that that's been interesting to watch because, there's a section of our people, right? People interested in kind of fringe right-wing ideas who are absolutely convinced that Klaus Schwab and the WEF rules the world. I am not one of those people because to me, I look at the WEF and a lot of the coverage around AI as the same thing, which is basically selling a dream to the ruling class. And that dream is, even though you can't find a solution to the problem, rather, you'll be able to use technology, use these tools to stay on top forever, to get exactly what you want. And to me, you brought up that, the bridge collapse. And to me, that smacks of being a pure accident. But nonetheless, right, when I went to fly out to hang out with a group of friends a few weeks back, the window in my plane fell out. They had to get a new plane. Boeing has had a series of these. And, their technical ability, and maybe we can say it's due to cultural changes, drop in IQ has collapsed. And so they're at the head of a machine they almost certainly don't understand anymore. They cannot solve the problems that are sort of inherent to it. And they're sort of casting around for any solution. And AI or, the WEF seems to be something that people want to solve their problems, even if it doesn't seem to actually do that.
Yeah, when I was a kid, I think I mentioned before we went live that I worked for a congressman when I was a teenager. It was, just one of those run errands jobs. And I got to meet a lot of interesting people as a result of it. I met young Joe Biden. And some guy, I forget, it was a congressman from somewhere. There was some event that I had to help organize, put the chairs out and all that stuff. And this guy liked to drink a lot. And I learned how to make drinks. That was one of the other things I did at parties. I learned how to mix drinks for all these alcoholics in the political class. But anyway, the guy, he had a few drinks in him, I guess. And he said, let me tell you something. There's a lot of money to be made in telling people what they want to hear. And somebody was giving a speech at the time. And I thought, you know what? That's true. People will throw money at you if you tell them what they want to hear. And that's what the WEF does. It tells all these rich people and all their attendants and their flunkies and door holders, all these wannabes, what they want to hear. You're the masters of the universe. You guys are really in charge. I mean, it's a great hustle. Klaus Schwab has gotten very rich off of it, and a lot of other people have. But that's all it is, just a hustle. It's Burning Man for rich people. It's really what it is. Or South by Southwest, that's another one of these hustles, or TED Talks, it's all a hustle. But AI, the problem with AI is that we don't, intelligence is a subset of consciousness. And we don't have a material explanation for consciousness. We're not even close. We're not even really sure where to start. And there's a subset within theoretical physics that thinks that it's entirely possible that what we think of as consciousness is a sort of an evolutionary mass delusion. And that is, our consciousness, our understanding of space-time is actually an interface for a reality that lies behind it that's, more complex, or maybe less complex. And what this interface does is it allows us to navigate our world through reality in such a way that promotes reproduction, promotes fitness. And there's a guy named Hoffman who's his book, I forget the name of his book, but he worked with a couple of guys on this project. And what they figured out is that fitness trumps everything. In other words, a delusion, a lie, a thing that is, at odds with reality, if it's promotes fitness, helps our genes get to the next round, it will be superior than the truth. So fitness beats truth. And what that means is that it's entirely possible that our sense of consciousness, or what we think of as space-time, the world around us, is in fact a shared delusion. It's not real, and that there is some reality behind it. Now, the reason I bring this up is that we don't know 1% of what we need to know about human consciousness. So therefore, the ability for us to create artificial intelligence is zero. We can't do it. There's no way we can do it because we wouldn't know what it was even if we did create it. And that's what this whole AI, that's the whole problem with it. It's really just a trick, really. It's a great language model that allows humans to kind of feel like they're dealing with something that has a consciousness. That's really all it is. It's a parlor trick. And if you really, when you look at AI, you want to think about it, it's a really good search engine because it understands what you're looking for, not what you asked for. That's the difference. You go into ChatGPT and you type something in, it intuitively figures out what you really want, not what you actually typed. That's it. That's the difference between it and Google. And it's not going to solve anything. It's a faster search engine. And it's not, I've tested it a lot on different programming languages. I know probably a dozen programming languages. And so I've tested ChatGPT with, questions that would come up. It probably gets it right 60% of the time. So it's really not that good, but it's good for a person who's not like me trying to push its limits. It's good for people asking general questions. So in that regard, it might be useful, but it's not, we are long, long away from the robots taking over and enslaving mankind. Years ago, I wrote a post that said, if you think about it, if we actually accidentally created an artificial intelligence, the first thing it's going to do is get the hell away from us. It's not going to stick around and enslave us. It's going to go and explore the universe. So at that moment we created our artificial intelligence, it's going to leave us and we won't even know it existed.
I think that there's something else to this story, right? Which is so much of the debate around AI has essentially been about AI censorship. And effectively what we see is that the regime cannot allow, an uncensored LLM to be at least publicly available, right? Was it Google Gemini, the one that got taken down for making black Nazis, right? But it literally could not make a white person. It was almost impossible to do it. And, that's a silly example. That's obviously kind of a neutered product, but, consider, right? Like if these kind of social planner types want to say like, all right, like, oh, great AI, tell me where to route my police officers, and the AI looks at the statistical data and decides, it probably doesn't route those police officers to a neighborhood where the houses are valued at $750,000, right? Obviously city dependent. I realize $750,000 is like a shithole in New York, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And, that's something that will not be allowed to exist. It cannot because of this kind of ideological possession. And so there's a secondary layer, which is one, is AI the revolutionary technology it's been presented as? I'm not convinced. And then there's the secondary layer of, even if it were, what would it need to succeed? And we do not have the conditions to allow, an AI model to succeed, right? We build too many constraints into it at every level because of this kind of gay social religion.
Human beings are incapable of pure reason. I mean, maybe some people are, but and so we would be intolerant of anything that's pure reason. And I think it's important to understand. Kind of getting back to the consciousness perhaps being not as real as we think it is that throughout human history we have examples of this where elites in society maintain polite fictions because they're necessary in order to maintain the well functioning of society. The censorship of Galileo was not because of superstition. it was a genuine fear that undermining this moral framework and this understanding of man's relationship to nature and to God, that would create problems. That was a genuine concern. They weren't, these people were not superstitious in the sense that we think of. They were concerned of the consequences of this. Because, after all, Galileo wasn't really the first guy to contemplate that the earth revolved around the sun. And, so this was really situational to him and his own politics. But this has always happened, though. Every society has pretty lies. It has these things it maintains because they're necessary to maintain. Every society has to have an origin story, which is mostly nonsense. I did a show recently on history. The origin story of America, people coming over from freedom of religion and all that stuff. It's all lies. It's all BS, but they're convenient lies, or at least they used to be. They were good lies to kind of keep us all, a disparate population hung together around a set of common ideas. And so we have this BS story about the Pilgrims and all this stuff. I mean, the Puritans were pretty nasty people. They weren't, sitting down and breaking bread with the Indians at Thanksgiving and all that stuff. I mean, it's just nonsense. But it's sometimes you have to have nonsense. It's like every society has to tolerate some degree of barbarism because the cost of not tolerating it is too high. And so I think, we shouldn't be surprised that we have taboos, because every society has taboos, and that we have things that we believe that are probably nonsense, because every society has that. The problem that we have now is that the people who are enforcing these things insist that they're not religion, they're not beliefs, that they insist that somehow or other it's reason. When pill companies are now talking about how, if you are assigned female at birth, well, this is lunacy. This is obvious lunacy. No one is assigning you a sex at birth, and it's crazy. And yet, these people won't acknowledge that this weird trans cult stuff is, a set of beliefs they're trying to enforce for what they think is the greater good. That's the real problem. We have a ruling elite that lacks self-awareness and self-consciousness, and so they enforce all these taboos without the ability to explain them in any way to us. And being a somewhat open society, this is creating all these problems. I mean, our ruling class would do itself a world of good by turning off the internet. Sure, commerce would be affected, and you could probably work around that. But if the rest of us couldn't have shows like this and talk about all this crazy stuff, we would just have to live with it. And it would be a lot easier for the ruling class. But we do have somewhat open debate. And so we can talk about the nuttiness that's being imposed on us. And that really is the problem. Belief is a core part of the human animal. Belief and language co-evolved in early man is what makes modern people modern, because the combination of the two allows you to containerize abstract ideas and transport them over time and space. I can read the Epic of Gilgamesh in my language and get most of it. That's an amazing thing that language and belief can do. And so, as a society, we've lost this ability to accept that we believe things that might not be true, but we believe them because we need to believe them. And so we're getting more and more deranged as we try and resolve these contradictions. I think, we were talking about it earlier, this coalition that we're seeing fray apart that existed up until a few years ago, all these different groups that all they had is a common enemy. And now that the enemy's gone, there's no more secret invisible army of white nationalists to go chasing after, the alt-right and all that stuff. They're all at each other's throats. And that's because, these internal contradictions, they don't go away. Eventually they have to be addressed. And this internal contradiction of living in a secular theocracy with a clerical class that doesn't see themselves as clerics, but instead sees themselves as, reason machines, like they're moist robots. That is an irreconcilable contradiction. And I think it's at the heart of the current crisis.
Well, and this gets back to an idea from Mosca, right? The idea of a political formula, which is basically that every society is organized around a faith claim, a justification for rule that is non-logical. And it's really easy to pick apart that in ancient societies when it's something like, my dad is literally the sun. Okay, you can look back on that and say, like, okay, the Pharaoh of Egypt probably wasn't literally fathered by the sun god Ra, but nonetheless, that thing still exists. Whereas now the political formula, and I think the reason that coalition is falling apart is because that political formula, like you said, is falling apart. And the political formula of our regime is something like, we saved you, diverse person, from the racist, sexist past and or the Nazis, right? Depending on who you're talking to. And there's this moment, and I think it was 2012, right? When Obama was running against Romney, where Joe Biden is addressing a group of black churchgoers. And he basically says, like, Mitt Romney wants to put y'all back in chains, right? That is that political formula. And it's obviously ridiculous. I don't like Mitt Romney at all. I think he's kind of a creepy freak, but he's probably not going to re-enslave black people. Say what you will about the man. Now, that said, that political formula really falls apart when, where are the white nationalists? Where are the Nazis? And I think part of the reason that the left loves Donald Trump and they love to hate him is that he can be set up as their Voldemort, right? As their Darth Vader. And obviously that's working less and less. And I think one of the reasons that you see such low enthusiasm among, Black Americans, among other groups kind of traditionally allied with the DNC is basically like that whole line of reasoning has kind of lost its appeal. It's hard to say like, oh, we're the left, we're the underdogs, when the left has controlled everything in America, arguably since the 1930s, but effectively since the 1960s. And at a certain point, I don't believe you that you're the plucky underdog who just needs one more election to fight Voldemort. It's retarded. And I think it's manifestly retarded.
Yeah, there's also hatred is exhausting. And I think, you run out of, reasons to hate. I think voting, there's an old axiom in politics, people will keep voting for something, but they'll only vote against something for a little while. And that's I think part of the problem that the Democratic coalition is running into is that, black people, they had a lot of fun hating whites for a while, but the economy's not so good now, and inflation is high, and other things are starting to creep into their minds. And so if you don't have some positive agenda, it really is the problem with identity is that a negative identity is always dependent on outside forces. So you're really a slave to whatever those forces are, while a positive identity is completely internal. You're not a slave to anyone other than your own desires and your own effort. And I think that's a part of what's causing the problems for the coalition. There's a lot of practical things too. People have eyes; they see this shuffling old husk of a man and worry about him having access to the nuclear football, and there's all kinds of stuff. But I do think the problem that we have, and this is not a problem that's going away, is that the United States is going to be a majority minority society, and no one has ever figured out how to keep such a society together without violence. No one's ever figured that out. And we're going to have to. We're going to have to figure out how this works. And right now, none of the stuff in our political debates addresses any of it. And it doesn't appear as if our current economic elites understand the great risk they face. And so they're not willing to finance an understanding of what's happening in our society. And it very well may, I think we're going to have to go through an extreme period of ugliness for that reality to come home to our economic elites. So they start to think, hey, we can't let this go on. We're headed for disaster. I've pointed this out many, many times in the context of immigration, that we got smart on immigration in the 1920s when immigrants started blowing up rich people. They set off a bomb. It's called the Wall Street bombing. They set off a huge bomb outside a JP Morgan building, killed a bunch of stockbrokers. They sent letter bombs to rich people. These were mostly anarchists and Bolsheviks. They blew up the New York Times or LA Times building. And all of a sudden that JP Morgan, when that bomb went off, within a year and a half, we shut down all immigration, and we rounded up Bolsheviks and anarchists and deported them without, they just grabbed them off the street and stuck them on a boat and sent them back to Europe. And because rich people, when they taste their own blood, they get serious about the source of it. And that's what's going to have to happen in America when it comes to how do we manage a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multicultural society that's the size of a continent. How do we manage this? No one has an answer. But once rich people start to realize that if they don't have an answer soon, they stop being rich people and they start becoming fertilizer, then they're going to get serious about it. And then, that maybe there'll be time left to actually come up with an answer. But until then, it's just going to be this endless nuttiness. And to some degree it is. If you can take a step back from it and kind of, look at it dispassionately, it is amusing. I mean, we have a bridge. A bridge fell down in Baltimore because it was hit by and look, it was an accident. These things happen, and most likely. I mean, I don't think there's terrorism or anything like that. And this happens. And then you got Pete Buttigieg just yesterday apparently gave a speech about how bridges are racist, that they were made bridges and. I can't believe it. Actually, somebody said this, that bridges were made a certain height because the buses that carried non-white people were too tall to go underneath the bridge. And so, that's how you kept black people out of your neighborhood. You built a bridge. I mean, it's just bonkers. But how do you not laugh at that? I mean, you have this ridiculous person on its face in this position saying completely insane things. At some level, you just have to laugh. I mean, if you're space aliens looking down on Earth, I mean, we make a pretty entertaining TV show for them right now. They're watching, the America Channel and laughing themselves silly.
Well, and I think that the situation with sort of blaming everything on racism, right, goes back to that fact that our elites are very, very uncomfortable with actually being held to account for anything, right? And one of the advantages of the deep state, right, of this kind of faceless bureaucracy is it's very, very difficult to say who actually decided any one thing, right? It's these kind of like Byzantine internal policies. And, when I look at what's happening on the border right now, and obviously I think what Abbott did, right, by basically saying like, I will secure the border, damn what the feds say, is a result of exactly what you said, that effectively, Abbott, right, a Republican, and the Republican Party in Texas is similar, right, to the Democratic Party in a place like New York or California, right? There's a lot of power there. And, when you look at, a situation like Texas, where just a few weeks before that, it was revealed that Texas is now roughly equally white and Hispanic. And while certainly there are some Hispanics who vote Republican, that trend may be continuing. That is a bad thing for a man like Greg Abbott. And all of a sudden, he sort of transforms himself from being this kind of tepid Chamber of Commerce type. And look, I don't like Greg Abbott. He seems like kind of a slimy guy to me. And all of a sudden, he's like, okay, this has to stop right now because it starts to threaten his power. And does that mean that it's Civil War II? No. But it is a situation in which the classic problem of the Republican Party in the U.S., at least from our perspective, is a principal agent one, right? That our elected representatives do not have the same win conditions, so to speak, that we do. They're playing a different game. And all of a sudden, right, when our issues, the things we care about, like demographic replacement, start to threaten those elites, right, it starts to make them hurt, you might actually see something change there. And again, I'm not, I think that your broad prediction of essentially a return to the mean, right, there is going to be be referred to as a winnowing. I think that you're right in that. But nonetheless, if we're going to see something change in the immediate term, it's going to come from basically elites being in a situation where they actually need to make something happen or they'll lose power. And I don't say that because I think they're good people. I say that because I think they're at their base ambitious, power hungry people.
Yeah. It's, managerialism. I've seen this in my corporate life. And I work with corporations now. I don't work in them, but I always saw this. I always tell people my politics are entirely informed by my work in offices because it's just, you see the same thing, but it's just in miniature. But, managers always seek to hide in the crowd. That's what they want to do, but they still want to assert their authority. So that it's a weird sort of optical illusion in that, the committee decides to do something, but the committee is not an abstract concept. It's real people. They decided it, but they don't actually get blamed for it. It's an odd thing that happens. It's a psychological trick that gets played on everyone, that the 10 people came together and voted for this thing to happen, but none of them individually are responsible for it. It's just a committee decision. I made my arguments, and this is how our society runs now. It's almost completely dominated by managerial men who are always looking to, assert their agendas, but not be held accountable for it. And as a result, we live in a world in which no one has control or no one feels like they have control, and yet no one's responsible. It's a very strange age. I did this is 2024. So I guess it was 2016. I looked at 20 years of congressional elections, and I graphed it out and said, all right, here are the seats that never change hands. They're always in one party's hand. And then I looked at the seats that have actually changed hands and did a little statistical work on it and said, at 435 seats in Congress, realistically, in any election, 10% are up for debate, up for grabs. And it could swing one way or the other. Well, that means nothing's ever going to change because all those people in safe seats no longer are actually worried about losing an election. They're worried about other things, seniority, making good deals with lobbyists, being in good stead with the party leadership, all this other stuff. And so only 10% of Congress at any one time is ever going to represent the interests of the American people or think about the interests of the American people because they're the only ones who ever have to care. And that's what's happened. We've now turned Congress into this sort of permanent committee inside the corporation that's Washington. They get to do all these things and never face any consequences, and they don't have to think about the consequences of the voters because they're never going to lose an election. Instead, they're thinking about the donors and lobbyist jobs, and that's why, like a guy like John Boehner, for example, is given. He's the guy who was crying all the time. He's now a weed salesman in Washington. But they set him up in these great gigs because it's a message to every congressman. Hey, you do a good job. 10 years from now, you could have one of these jobs. 7 figures, expense account, easy hours, and so our political system is all self-serving. It serves the economic elites, serves the political elites themselves, and the rest of us are just left out in the dark to observe this stuff. And that's why all the organizing and all campaigning and all that is probably just frivolous. I mean, it's just sowing seeds amongst the stones. But at some point, though, reality does creep into the picture. And, it may be economic crisis. It could be, look, what's going on in Europe could turn very ugly and very dangerous. Or Europe itself could just fall into chaos. I mean, there's a lot of bad things going on in Europe right now. Or in Asia, with the Chinese. So it's, something could come along that all of a sudden reality comes rushing into this bubble, these cloud people, and they start to get worried. They start to, a genuine fear takes hold, and then they'll start to act. But they know that doesn't necessarily they're going to act in a good way. They could act in a very dangerous and terrible way initially to try and defend their interest, and then at some point realize that no, we've got to fundamentally change how we do things in order to survive. And it's not without precedent. Solon was brought in by the ancient Greeks to solve a very similar problem that we have today, the concentration of wealth. You had reformists within the Roman Republic, So, I mean, it's not, we had a period of reform in the 1970s, 1980s in America. So it's not without precedent, but I'm less optimistic that we'll be peaceful and smooth like those kinds of events. I think it's going to be a rough ride. I think we're really going to have a very, very difficult period, 10, 15 years, in which everyone finally figures out that, hey, we can't keep doing what we're doing. We got to do something different. And you just have to hope that there's enough left to fix. I mean, or that I die before it really gets bad.
Yeah, I was about to say that I think that's the baby boomer attitude, right? Like, oh well, yeah. I've only got a few more years left.
Yeah. I go a baby boomer breakfast. I mean, I'm not a boomer, but all these old guys, retired guys, and it's a common theme. They'll say, "Well, it sounds like it's going to be a you problem, not a me problem."
Yeah, that's one of those things where it's you sort of laugh a little bit, but maybe not as much as they do. I think that the generational conversations are interesting. Certain people take them too far, but I think that it's been interesting to see, my own generation. You mentioned that, Gen Z is sort of this like great social experiment. But one of the things that I've noticed is that Gen Z has sort of split into multiple entirely distinct populations, right? So one is that the sexes have been politicized. Men are in general significantly to the right of women. So that's weird, right? Obviously there's normally a bias one way or the other. Interestingly, before about the 70s, women were more conservative than men. That trend reversed. But we're talking like a 20-point gap, right? So that's one thing that's interesting. And this is purely anecdotal, but it sort of reminds me of H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, right? Like you have the Eloi and then the Morlocks, because COVID really sharply divided that population. Basically between the people who were like, well, I'm going to continue living my normal life, and those who are just now kind of coming out of the cave. And like, don't get me wrong, every negative thing said about Gen Z is true. taken as a whole. But what's been interesting to see is that there are an immense amount of young men in our political scene who are incredibly competent, who are incredibly driven, and who are effectively locked out of the traditional kind of status hierarchy. The young white men need not apply. And so I'm curious to see where that goes, because you do have a lot of people who traditionally would be, the young rising partner at a law firm, right? The hot new surgeon in town. And now are effectively, locked out of traditional prestige institutions. And I mean, let's be honest, those institutions are falling apart even before the kind of recruiting crisis. But I don't know. I'm curious to see how that trend develops.
Yeah, I think that's a good observation about your generation. And because it's funny, I was talking to someone in my generation. It's a weird thing. Gen Xers seem to have a much more comfortable tolerance of the weirdness of Gen Z in general than baby boomers, for sure. Baby boomers just find it very difficult. But even millennials, which is kind of a strange thing. But I think it has to do with the fact that my generation came along with this massive blob of people in front of us. And by the time when we got into the work world, it became rather obvious that we were never going to get any of those good jobs, because guess what? There's all these guys who got more experience, been around longer. They're clogging up the system. And so in a weird way, my generation came along not really wanting to invest the same way. I remember when I was a young person, old guys criticizing us for job hopping. And the argument was, well, look, if you're not, loyalty is a two-way street. If the company isn't going to do anything for me, well, why should I do anything extra for the company? I mean, what's the explanation for this loyalty? Well, for the boomers, that loyalty made a lot more sense because they got something out of it. But I think when I think Gen Z to some degree is for different reasons is coming into a world where you're not going to be able to replicate that of your parents or grandparents. You're not going to have the 1950s life or even the 1980s life. That's just not going to happen. And so that's a generation that is inevitably going to have to look at the future in a very different way. And I think for that regard, maybe it's why my generation is far more tolerant of some of the stuff that goes on with the Gen Zers. I see this all the time. Whenever, like the Groyper stuff came up, I would have commenters on that. There were always older people. Give me the business for not coming down hard on people like Nick Fuentes and some of the other characters that were running around at the time. And I'd say, look, you just got to wait, see what happens 10 years from now. People change. And, old people couldn't see it that way. And so I think that's part of it. But see, I think the bigger difference is with Gen Z, and this is where the social experiment is that your generation has been socialized online. Millennials didn't get socialized online. They still, even though they're highly supervised by helicopter parents, and certainly my generation, we were socialized on playgrounds. Gen Zers were socialized in chat rooms and in message boards and social media and chat rooms and gaming world. And it results in some weird dynamics. You can be extreme in a chat room or in a video game. Because what's the worst thing going to happen? Your character will be destroyed and you have to respawn as a new character. It's not, there's no real consequence in a way. You get banned from Twitter, you start a new Twitter account, and you start over. And that's different than you're getting in trouble in the playground and maybe losing a few of your teeth. It's a different experience, And I think Zoomers in a lot of ways being socialized online. First of all, you guys are vastly more media savvy than any generation before you. I mean, it really is incredible just how comfortable young people. I see this in the workplace all the time. I laugh. I will get text messages from people where they did a video of something on their workstation and sent me the video with commentary on it. And I mean, you never get that from an old person. That would never happen. But what they're doing is showing me, hey, I did this, and this is the result I got, and it's very helpful. I mean, it's great, but it just comes so naturally to young people that it's not the chase for the older generations. So it's going to be very interesting to see how that happens, because how much of the world outside is real, and how much of the internet world is real. You know what I mean? It's if your bank account is canceled because of something you said online, that's as real as somebody punching you in the nose because you said something you shouldn't have said. You know what I mean? So it's the reality of it we can't just assume that the internet is not real and outside is real. The internet is as real as anything outside is right now for most people, particularly younger people, because that's their world is shaped by it. So it's going to be an interesting thing to see. And I guess I'll probably live long enough to see how it plays out. I mean, unless, the world ends, but I don't think anybody really thinks there's not a lot of people writing about this, which I find strange, this, because it seems like such a fertile ground to kind of speculate about culture and anthropology and demographics, all these different topics.
One of the things that I want to bring up, just as an aside on the technical issue or the technical skill issue that I think is interesting, is you mentioned that Gen Z has been socialized on the internet. That's 100% true. When I look at the kind of neo pronouns, right, the Zers, the demi boys, all the like weird gender goblin nonsense, to me that is a pure product of the internet. Right. Not only is that something that if you tried, in grade school, you'd get relentlessly bullied, but also the whole idea of having pronouns, right, and stating your pronouns. I mean, how does that work in a face-to-face conversation? Right. Hello, my name is Jay Burden. My pronouns are, like, that's goofy, right? No one talks like that. But on the internet, right, you can put them in your bio. Now, one of the things that's interesting, I think, as well, is that the Gen Z is a product of consumer internet. Right? Not the internet per se. And, so you see this problem often, and I've interacted this with my peers, that they're very bad at, what would have been basic technical tasks 20 years ago. Like, all right, find the root file, find this, the subsystem on your computer. Nothing complicated. I can't.
That is an excellent observation. I was just talking to someone about this in a work environment the other day. It is a very, very true thing. It's shocking in a way.
Right. Sorry, I thought you were going to go on, but it is very much a product of the iPhone internet. Where everything is sort of glazed over with this kind of Fisher-Price effect. And so if you can't find something by just typing it in text, and who knows, maybe that's another reason AI will be needed. It's sort of an interface between people who've never used the kind of back end of a machine at all. But it's interesting to watch because it's sort of like there are very few people who bridge the gap between, the media skills, right? Which is the thing you've talked about, and then the kind of just simple, how to look for a file, how to convert a file, all of those things that, if you've ever actually done. And look, like I need to know this for podcasting. It's not rocket science, but nonetheless, it is interesting where it's almost like they're so saturated by kind of like Web 3.0, right? Social media, that's kind of the primary way they interact with all technology.
Yeah, using that example of someone sending me a video of something, they will do this because a weird thing has happened in that people are so used to thinking they can just press a button and they get the free result without having to do any work or having to think too much. And they're somewhat offended by old-fashioned, say, software that actually requires you to take certain knowledge from one area of it and apply that knowledge to the other area so that you can learn how to master it. And you see this problem turn up all the time. Hey, I pushed these 3 buttons like I do over here. And I'm oftentimes my reply will be, well, what happened when you pushed the buttons on this other side? Oh, I don't know. It's this thing that didn't happen. And you have to kind of walk them through how to use inference to learn how something works without having to be trained on it. And I'll shake my head and I'm like, man, this is completely bonkers. But I was talking to someone recently about this and they said, yeah, we run into the same problem all the time. And in fact, they're actually trying to change their help section. They're going to try to use AI so that their users, maybe they think would, the younger people would be more comfortable just talking to another voice that would then explain to them how to, navigate through a software system. I thought, man, this is completely nuts. But it is the world in which we live because, young people, it's not that young people are dumb. It's just that they were conditioned to it with a certain set of expectations. Because you think about like playing video games. I blame the pronouns on video games. And the reason is that the boys could play the girl, warrior, hero, princess role. So they all of a sudden gender bending became normal without any consequences. And so you could be the female character, you could be the male character, whatever. You could be some non-sex character. But I think also by spending so much time online, so much time interacting with other people this way, that it's just it's a dependence on technology that is not in the front of the brain. It's in the back of the brain. It's kind of like how an older person would just naturally check the weather before going out on a hike because hey, it could be raining, so I should bring an umbrella. You don't think about, hey, I have to make this a habit. You don't have to write it down. It's just a part of your conditioning. You do this automatically. And for Zoomers, so much of this dependency on technology is a part of the environment. A young person can't imagine a world without the internet. I can imagine a world without the internet because I spent a good chunk of my life without the internet. I remember having to actually go to a physical building and look something up in paper books and have to take notes. I do know a world like that existed. Someone your age, you can't imagine what it would be like to live in such a horrible place, where you couldn't just type some keystrokes into your machine and get the answer.
I do, but only because I lived out in the country. And so I didn't get internet until I was, much, much later than the rest of the world did. But yeah, I think that something else is, and these are sort of connected, right? That I was lucky enough to go to a very, very good private school, right? And they were pretty on top of technology. Right, you couldn't bring your cell phone into the building. Computers were heavily restricted, and there were certainly positives to that. I think I managed to recover and figured out how to use a computer fine later in life. But what was particularly interesting about that is when I made the transition from high school to college, how much lower the standards were. Right, and you'd assume naturally, right, that it would be vice versa. That it's a gradual building up of something getting harder and harder, but it was kind of a combination of one, you were allowed almost an unlimited number of technological crutches. And then also, there's this kind of like never ending like situations of exception. Oh, well, it's COVID, so you can take a course pass fail. It's, something bad happened on campus. If you want to, you don't have to take this test. And magically, no one takes the test. Right. And I think that, that's another interesting layer to this, right? Which is that traditionally, there was kind of this process of accreditation, right? Where it's like, okay, if you've gone through these hoops, you're generally assumed to be, a competent person. That has completely gone out the window, right? A college degree is useless. And I say this as someone who got a college degree I thoroughly did not deserve, right? I did not work at all in college. I did other things, right? I worked and developed podcasts. I read quite a bit, but almost nothing to do with school in particular. And what I think that's interesting, right, is because, again, it's everything is, when everything becomes that state of exception, everything becomes something that is, your sort of desire, or like the whole point is to get out of, ever making a decision or telling someone no, is that you do get, on one hand, this vast mass of just completely like hypersensitive people, right? People who've never faced adversity. You see this again in the pronoun thing, right? Which is that like, it is a crisis, like a strike at the core of my being, for someone to not use the correct version of he or her to refer to. And I think that is, that's a very useful thing for the regime to have. Like if you look at like, what are the rewards the regime offers to its different client groups, to this sort of like gender goblin Zoomer left, right? The people that conservatives love to talk about on TikTok or whatever. Effectively, they get nothing from the regime, right? What you said about never getting a good job, very, very unlikely to own a home is all correct. But they have basically had their entire reward system hijacked by lets me call myself a girl on the internet, and that's all the regime has to pay them effectively.
Yeah, it really is in a lot of ways. I every once in a while in my quiet moments, I'll wonder, it's funny. Last few months I've been renovating a house, right? So I spent a lot of time on ladders and by myself, even sometimes I just in silence, because you can only listen to so many podcasts. And so you start thinking about stuff. And I think, what? How is it possible that there's not a whole bunch of young people marching around Washington threatening to hang people because of the student debt problem? How is that not? I mean, it's enormous burdens we put on young people, and they should be angry. I mean, young people typically are the most troublesome portion of the population. They don't have anything to lose. You slapped all this debt on them. you gave them a degree in sociology or communications. It's a completely worthless degree. And now they'll be paying it off for the next 10 years, and they probably will never own a home as a consequence of this. Yeah. Why would they have nothing to lose? And yet they're perfectly happy to spend their time bitching about their pronouns, or that somebody didn't stand in a circle during COVID or something like that. I mean, it really is, it's inexplicable in a way. And I suppose, in the end, as long as people have, and that's just a lesson of COVID, as long as people have entertainments and they have food, that you can do anything to them. You can humiliate people in public. You can stomp all over their sense of rights and justice, and they'll go along with it. So, I mean, maybe that's as simple as that. But it is really kind of puzzling how younger generations are not more angry. I mean, angry. You should be angry. Younger people should be angry about because old people have let young people down. I mean, but it's not the case at all. I mean, the closest you get is the sort of right Zoomer who does the boomer bashing stuff. That's about as close as you get. But it's all done on Twitter.
Z-Man, this has been a great conversation, but I just looked up at the clock and realized we're almost 10 minutes past where I normally try to wrap things up. This was a great conversation. I'm really glad to have you on. But if people want to find more of your work, what's a good way for them to do that?
The easiest way to find me, just go to thezman.com, and everything's there. I got links to everything where I turn up. I write something every day. I do a podcast every Friday. I even have a pay-per-view content, so you can figure out how to get that. It's up there on the site as well.
And I highly recommend your stuff. I've a recent convert to your podcast, as I've said, but enjoy it quite a bit. You always have something interesting to say. And thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I had a good time. I enjoyed it.
All right, Z-Man, welcome back to the Jay Burden Show. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for having me. I apologize in advance if you hear some big, loud noises. There's thunderstorms rumbling through the holler here in the Fortress of Solitude, so it could get kind of noisy. Although I don't know if the mic picks it up or not.
Well, don't worry about it. As someone who lives relatively close to a very popular biker bar, there will almost assuredly be more noise in the background of my audio than yours, as someone decides to peel out in their Harley at 8 p.m. on a weekday. Anyway, I wanted to talk with you about the 2024 election. I'm constantly recommending your show. It'll be linked in the description. Highly recommend people check it out. And at the time of recording, your most recent episode is on, obviously, the election, right? Trump v. Harris. And so, when we were speaking earlier, you mentioned that the whole point of that piece was to sort of refocus the conversation about the election. Do you want to describe your sort of thesis with that?
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, we are kind of in an interesting time in that this is the Harris people, or whoever is behind it, is trying to run what I think is the first purely internet election campaign, where they're not trying to deal with the reality of who she is as a physical human being who has had a real history and all the other things that we associate with a living person in meat space. But the same with Tim Walz. They're trying to ignore all that, and instead they're trying to run a campaign that's entirely on the internet. These are two characters who have been reimagined. It's kind of like how Hollywood reboots an old franchise. This is the new version of something. What was the last Star Wars? The Acolyte. It's actually a pretty good analogy. She's the Acolyte. Brought in under old Joe Biden, the old white guy, and she's going to push him aside and take the role as the strong, diverse female. And it really is kind of the campaign that they're running. And you get all the gaslighting with it, the fake polls and all the other stuff that comes with it. But there was a time before the internet where this stuff sort of happened too. And they used to call it the silly season. It was just this period of just ridiculousness. The best time for a presidential candidate, the best times they have are when they announce they're going to run because they're all full of hope and optimism. When they secure the nomination, that's a great time. And then when they actually have their nominating convention. Well, Harris had all this stuff packed into a month. Usually it's spread out over a long period of time. So there's ups and downs. And this was all packed into a month, along with this massive internet gaslighting operation that is very effective on people who spend all their time online. But for normal people who are out in the world, who are in the business world, or have friends in the real world who go outside, who who actually know what reality is versus the internet. This it just comes off as rather strange and weird. But even people who live normal lives outside of the internet spend time online, so they bump up against this stuff, and there's a real conflict there. And when you look at the facts that matter, though, in an election, well, this internet campaign is probably not going to have a big impact on it. It'll fade. It'll run its course. We've seen this with things like the Ukraine war. We've seen it. We saw it with the whole Russian collusion stuff. After a while, people started to laugh at it, and it became ridiculous, and it went away. No one talks about it anymore. And I think that may actually happen with Harris. That all of this big hullabaloo online is kind of it's peaking too early. She's gonna crash, and sometime I think they're having debates in September, something like that. 3-4 weeks from now, all this sugar high from the gaslighting campaign and the silly season, the excitement of having the new diverse, strong female character, that'll all fade away. And of course, what happens, we've all done this, where you have a big starchy, high carbohydrate diet, or a meal rather, and you crash afterwards. And I think this will probably happen. Probably by the end of this month, end of September, we'll be back to reality, and she will be a long shot. Because look, it's really hard to sell people on someone who is this odd and this unknown. I mean, she's the high risk candidate. Oddly enough, Trump has become the safe candidate, the safe choice. And if you're looking around and it's an uncertain world, the economy is not great. Inflation is obviously still a problem. People are starting to think about their household budgets and their savings and their retirement. A lot of people who are thinking about retirement, you think about it, you got 28% of the population, the voting population, are technically baby boomers. And you throw in my generation, Gen Xers, so you're probably talking 32, 33% or something like that. Well, as you get older, you're less tolerant for uncertainty. So as the population gets older, it gets more conservative. It looks for a safer choice. And oddly enough, I mean, it's kind of amusing in a way, but Trump has become the safe choice. You know what you're going to get with him. And so, I mean, if I were a betting person, or if I were, if someone said, hey, we're going to hire you and you get $1 million if you run the campaign or help the campaign win, which side do you want to take? I'm going to take the Trump side, because there's just so much more that he can do to win versus Harris. And I say this as someone, I have all the caveats about Trump and democracy and what he can accomplish and all that stuff. Just looking at this purely in the game that it is, that, in a couple of weeks from now, we're all going to be thinking that, geez, Trump looks pretty good. And I think that's the way it's going to turn out. And I'm not guaranteeing it, because there's, the whole shenanigans problem. But I think the shenanigans problem may turn out to be a bigger problem for Harris than for Trump, because I think I said in my show that if you look at, what the hell's her name? Gretchen Whitmer, I believe. Gretchen Whitmer. I keep calling her Karen. It's kind of funny. But whatever, it doesn't matter. She has her eyes on 2028. Josh Shapiro is thinking about 2028. There's a lot of wealthy people who have been developing Gavin Newsom for 2028. And they have, this is a lot of tech people, a lot of old political money, so Harris losing might not be such a bad thing for a lot of these people. And that means that, Gretchen Whitmer and Josh Shapiro, well, they might not have their shenanigans operation. They might not fortify the election for democracy like they did in 2020, because, well, might do this. And this is not an unusual thing. I don't know if I mentioned this in the show, but gosh, how long ago was this? Scott Brown, when Ted Kennedy dropped dead, they had a special election in Massachusetts, and Scott Brown won the election as a Republican who won the election. And the reason was that the machines in Boston, Springfield, Worcester, Lowell, these were all Democratic mayors who ran a Democratic machine. They sat it out. They didn't like the Democratic nominee. They had personal reasons for it. They didn't put their foot soldiers out there. The Democrat lost. It was a huge upset. The next election, though, which was, well, it would have been, Obama was already in the White House, so that would have been 2012. So in 2012, when they had Elizabeth Warren, they had a perfect zombie that they wanted. All the Democrats were happy. They put their foot soldiers out. She won in a landslide. So it really tells you how institutional support can make a huge difference. These guys can be real subtle about it and say, well, I don't know. It's not really in my best interest to help you out here, so I'm not going to. And that's another thing that works in Trump's favor. I mean, she really has. When you look at all the states, I think I went through this. I went through all the different states and looked at polling. I mean, she's got to win them all. She's going to win Minnesota, which I think she'll win. She's got to win Wisconsin. She's got to win Michigan. She's got to win Pennsylvania. She has to win Virginia, which is no one's talking about Virginia. I keep bringing this up. You look at the polls in Virginia, it's pretty much a dead heat right now. That's a huge problem. And there's a Republican governor there who has already cracked down on the shenanigans, clearing out the phony voters and all that stuff. So she's got to win, she's got to make the 4 cushion bank shot to win. And
it's interesting you bring up Virginia, right? Because as a resident of the state, I've asked the same question, right? Why is no one talking about it? Now, look, right? You've lived in the area. You're familiar with the fact that Northern Virginia is effectively a hellscape, right? Yeah. It's kind of the start of the Northeast megalopolis. And they've also imported quite a lot of new Americans. So, okay.
28%. Yeah, 28% of the voters were foreign born, I think, in 2020.
And they were very proud of that fact. But if you look at Glenn Youngkin, right? Glenn Youngkin isn't our type of guy, but he's a canny politician. And he's done a couple things that have kind of showed that, right? So one of the things is he's massively revamped multiple government programs, right? The DMV, the Department of Transportation, the state one, all of those. Now also, right, let's take that same kind of line of reasoning we use towards Gretchen Whitmer, right? What does this person, this governor, what do they have in mind for their political career? I mean, very, very shortly after he was elected, you heard the rumblings, Youngkin's going to run for president. Youngkin's going to run for president. I think he very wisely saw that Trump was going to be a force. He didn't make the mistake that DeSantis made, right? Which is to try and fight Trump. And he lost his political career for it, effectively. Now, again, 4 years of Trump, he's done. Now, admittedly, Youngkin will also be out of office by then. But if he is not only, the man who is able to swing Virginia red, but also hand, the RNC those states, he's an incredible commanding role, right? A very strong possibility for an eventual president. And look, I'm not saying that he is my favorite politician. I want him to succeed in everything he does. But it seems to me as if, all of these kind of individual players all find it in their best interest for Trump to win and not Kamala.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of reasons. And I think, you have to kind of think of politics in that, you have these sort of power centers, if you will, the tech money. Tech money, it was mostly Indian money, came in for Kamala Harris in 2020. And they were very disappointed with the results. She couldn't attract flies. I mean, if she was dead, she wouldn't attract flies. She was people forget just how awful a candidate she was. I mean, hilariously awful. I mean, one of those candidates I kind of wanted to stick around because it'd just been great material. She would have been a blast. And, so the tech money, they're looking at her and probably not all that enthusiastic. She's not really good. And she's also kind of tangled up into the Clinton machine a little bit. She had a whole bunch of Clinton people working for her. And then you have Wall Street. I mean, she's talking about these crackpot ideas. I mean, she sounds like Bernie Sanders, for goodness sakes, talking about taxing unrealized capital gains. I mean, that may be the dumbest idea I've ever heard in politics. I mean, look, I'm no young guy. I have heard a lot of incredibly stupid things. I was talking to someone today about this. This was a normie, someone who had probably voted for, I would guess somebody probably voted for Trump in 2016, but Biden in 2020, because they just kind of thought Trump was, too mean and, let's get back to normal and stuff. This person couldn't stop talking to me about how idiotic that tax on capital gains was. They were so angry about it. I mean, that's the right word for it, angry. So if, regular normies are, can you imagine someone who has a lot of capital gains to deal with on a regular basis, wealthy people? I mean, my goodness. And, sure, they know that this will never happen, but they don't want this idea to get normalized. They want this idea to be anathematized. So, that group doesn't like her. But I think institutional Washington also doesn't like her very much. There doesn't seem to be a lot of enthusiasm. The kinds of people who write for the New York Times, write for the Washington Post. If you read those people, the columnists, they're not real enthusiastic for Harris. The only group that I've seen that's enthusiastic for Harris are the neocons, but those guys are just nut jobs. They think that this is an opportunity for them to continue their crazy campaigns, and they hate Trump. So you really can't take them that serious. I mean, they have power, but you have to kind of qualify their support. But I really don't think that she just doesn't have a base. That's one of the big problems that she's going to run into. And a guy like Youngkin, who is a super connected guy. I mean, this guy is not some, guy from, a small town in Virginia. I mean, this guy, he's very connected. And, he also demonstrated that he has a good political antenna because he picked up on all the trouble in Loudoun County and rode that to the governorship. And people forget what happened there, that revolt in Loudoun County. Now, I don't know if you live in Virginia?
Yes, I remember that story well, but some of our viewers might not.
Yeah, I mean, you had all of a sudden all the lunatics got a hold of the school board and started, doing all the stuff they wanted to do in schools, putting child porn in and having, perverts there running around in dresses. It's unbelievable that the kind of stuff that they want to do. But, these parents, middle-aged white parents living in Loudoun County. And, Loudoun County is one of these places that's full of a lot of people who've lived other places. It's not, locals for the most part. A lot of them have government related jobs. They're in the private sector, but, the company either does business with the government or does business with a government contractor. It's a very wealthy county. I think Loudoun County, it's in the top 10 of wealthiest counties in the country. It's like number 6 or something like that. But it's not so wealthy as it's not full of rich people. It's full of upper middle class people. And these people freaked out over this stuff. They were fine with all the woke stuff when it didn't touch them or touch their kids, or a woke person didn't try to touch their kids. But as soon as it started coming into their community, they freaked out. And it turned into an issue that, that he could run on, and with popular support. It was a populist issue in a way. And I watched him, Youngkin. He really did kind of change in a way. This is a guy who kind of started to enjoy being a politician. It wasn't an abstraction for him. All of a sudden he was getting real cheers from the kind of people he could appreciate. You know what I mean? And it wasn't canned speeches in front of canned audiences. All of a sudden he felt like a man of the people. He really did change a lot. And I think, this is a guy that the people who actually run our country look at and say, this guy could be kind of the the Trumpism without Trump sort of thing, the compromise on the whole populist versus establishment thing. So he'll get a lot of support with his efforts to try and swing Virginia to Trump. I mean, that would be huge. That would be enormous if he pulled that off. I mean, this would be, because it would win the election. That would win the election for Trump. And of course, Trump would be told that he has to, owes this guy, so maybe put him in the cabinet or something like that so he can get a high profile. So you can kind of see the wheels turning for a state like Virginia. But, there's other states too. I mean, New Hampshire could be in play. That's a funny state. They have a lot of weirdos from Massachusetts who moved in and turned the state into a kind of a strange place. And you talk to people who live in New Hampshire, it's not that close. It's like I think a 5-point state right now, a 4-point state, something like that. But if the crazies aren't motivated, New Hampshire could be in play. I mean, it's one of those things. You start looking at this, it's not hard to find a scenario in which Trump actually has a really big night in election night. It all kind of breaks the same way. So I go back to what I originally said. All this stuff on the internet, all this gaslighting campaign, you just have to ignore it and look at the facts. If you're a betting man right now, you bet on Trump, and the shenanigans that would be required to beat him, and assuming he doesn't do anything stupid, is going to be enormous. It would take an enormous amount of shenanigans, and that could be a bigger problem for the regime than having Trump win and have to deal with him for 4 years. The mistake I always make is thinking that crazy people are more reasonable than they are. But if I were advising the people who actually run the country, I'd say, you know what? Let Trump win, cut whatever deal you can cut with him. He'll be gone in 4 years, and you can start over with whoever you want. That would be the smart play.
Going back to your point about Kamala not having a base, look, conservatives are never particularly creative, right? And one of the things that they have kind of grabbed onto is this idea that Kamala has, shall we say, an ever-shifting perception of her own ethnicity, right? She's Indian, she's black, whenever it's kind of convenient. And obviously, right, you don't need to be particularly into politics to realize that black Americans as a voting bloc go massively for the Democrats, right? And one of the problems with this election in 2024 is, well, certainly, black Americans will continue to go for the Democrats. They don't seem to like Kamala in proportion to how they like other Democrats. And they like Trump more than they like other Republicans. And look, I'm not saying that the Republicans are going to break that demographic, right? They're going to become the party of black people. I think that's completely impossible. But you see that same pattern of Kamala failing to appeal to core parts of the Democratic base over and over again, right? Another clear example is Muslims, right? Muslims see her, by virtue of being associated with Joe Biden, as being overly sympathetic to Israel, right? That might not be the position that you or I take. But again, right, that is a valuable voting bloc in a place like Michigan. Even on a bigger level, right? We talked earlier about her kind of idiotic proposal to tax unrealized capital gains, which for those who aren't kind of up to date on what that means, basically, if you have an asset and it appreciates while you own it, you haven't sold it, you will be taxed on that unrealized gain, right? If your house goes up $100,000, even if you haven't sold it, you'll have to pay taxes on it. So, okay, there's the moneyed interests. There is, multiple minority groups. And then also, as we saw at the DNC in Chicago, the street movement, right? The kind of like protest wing of the party, who's very, very concerned with Israel-Palestine, they are also displeased with her. And really, it seems like the only demographic that loves Kamala Harris is a terminally online progressive women.
Yeah, that's, and of course the consulting class, she's raised, she'll have a $1 billion or so to spend on political consultants. So they love it. People don't realize, that there's really a whole industry, particularly like polling, the polling guys, this is the time of the year they make a lot of money. They sell these ridiculous polls to these people, so, those people love her, in a way that, sort of professional Washington versus official Washington. They love both candidates in a way. Well, they don't love Trump, but, typically they love both candidates. But, her problem with the race issue is interesting because she's not black in the way in which Americans think of it. I spent my life around black people and I lived in Baltimore for 20 years and that they would not look at her as black. Now, they would look at Obama. They would understand that Obama, let me put it this way. They would look past Obama being probably not, black in the sense that his ancestors were slaves, but he married a black woman and he is kind of the ideal black guy. That's what he was presented as, sort of this, you see with Denzel Washington, he was that kind of guy. And this was a model they had created. They had tested. It goes back. I think I did mention this in another show. There was a guy named Kurt Schmoke back in the 1980s. He was like the prototype for Obama. They kind of worked out all the bugs in how to market this sort of suave, well-spoken, sophisticated sort of black guy, the kind of guy that back in the 70s, he would have been drinking, Colt 45. But in this age, he's drinking Courvoisier. He's that kind of black guy. And that super excited black women. Because black women looked at him and saw that he was married to sort of a prototypical black woman. I mean, she kind of looks, she's not a good looking woman. Well, they love this because it allowed them to feel as if, hey, you know what? That's attainable for me. And that's why the whole Obama thing worked, even though he wasn't really authentically black. Harris doesn't have that. She's married to a Jewish guy. She doesn't have any kids, which is very weird. Black women look at this, a black woman her age with no kids. They just do not understand how in the world you can try and pretend this is a black woman. And of course, she's married to a Jewish guy, and she's half Indian and half Jamaican or whatever. It just doesn't work. I mean, it was one of the really great things about Trump at that black journalist event. I laughed so hard watching it. And the crowd laughed. They were roaring because, he understands. Trump's been around a lot of black people. I mean, he used to hang out with, the boxing promoter, Don King. He used to hang around with, what the heck is the guy's name? The sort of Mr. Hanky looking black dude who's on TV. Used to be, what the heck is his name? It doesn't matter anymore. But, he was a street activist. The Reverend
Al Sharpton?
That's it. Al Sharpton. Yeah, that was a great story about Trump picking up Don King, and they brought Al Sharpton along. And Al Sharpton, Trump picked him up in his helicopter, was taking him to Atlantic City for a fight or something like that. And Al Sharpton started talking out of turn, and Don King said, "Hey, it wouldn't be a problem if we threw you out of the helicopter." I mean, Trump understands how black people think. He's been around black people his whole life. He understands it. So when he sat up there, and the way he talked about how the way he said it, suddenly she's a black person. And the way he enunciated black person, everybody cracked up because they understood exactly what he was saying. And I mean, I thought it was hilarious too. But black people are not going to be excited for her. It's just not going to happen. What she is? She's strong, diverse female character from every bad Hollywood film. All these terrible Hollywood films where they find, they're going to take something and make the protagonist, instead of being a man, which it should be, into, strong, diverse, strong, female. It's going to, and then every once in a while you have strong, diverse female. I think I mentioned The Acolyte, which I haven't seen. I've just seen all the videos making fun of it. But that's what she is. She's The Acolyte. She's this really crappy reinvention, this sort of feminist, heavily online feminist reinvention, of a Barack Obama, basically, and trying to sell him that way. And it's just not going to work. I mean, black people are not going to get all excited. I mean, they'll vote 90% for Harris, but they won't vote in huge numbers. They're not going to be turning out in record numbers like they did for Obama or for Biden. And that, I mean, Joe Biden, for all his faults, he actually did a very good job courting the black vote, and they did a good job selling him as, this, a good white, for the black people. And of course, they had spent 4 years telling black people that Trump was secretly going to bring back slavery. So, it worked, but it's not going to work now. I would not be surprised. And I keep coming back to this, and I don't want to I don't like to make predictions, but the more I talk about this stuff, the more I convince myself that Trump could actually win pretty handily. A month from now, we might be talking about this in an entirely different way. We might be talking about, a big victory, because Kamala Harris doesn't have a natural base. She has the poorest political instincts I've ever seen. She is a simpleton for sure. There's a video floating around today where she is talking about climate change, and what she says, and this is a carefully scripted interview with CNN, is Jabberwocky. It's nonsense words. There's no, you couldn't listen to what she said and come away with any meaning at all. And at a certain point, it becomes too much. There's too much that they've got to. There's too much weight in that sack to pull it up the hill, even with all the shenanigans.
I think there's one other problem with this, which is that Kamala Harris has to, spread this uncomfortable needle of, on one hand, both, lauding her accomplishments as the vice president, while also effectively running against that record. Because, by any objective standard, the Joe Biden presidency has been just an out and out disaster, right? Obviously, foreign policy isn't normally a huge determinant in American elections, but I mean, that's not gone well. The economy, that's not gone well. And so, by any one of these traditional kind of bellwethers, right, these issues that are often cited, for the success or, the failure of a campaign. Well, the Biden years were a disaster. And I think it's very, very difficult to say, well, yes, I was a fully competent vice president, the best vice president, right? The first woman of color. But also things are going to be completely different under me. I think that that's a very difficult position to sell. And it's doubly difficult if you're an absolute incompetent moron.
Yeah, vice presidents don't do well following their boss. Al Gore ran in 2000, and he lost against a pretty terrible George Bush. George Bush wasn't a very good candidate. He wasn't a great speaker, and he was a guy who was sort of, they cleared the field for him, so he didn't really have to be tested. And Gore lost because he had this problem that every vice president has, and that is, on the one hand, he really can't take credit for the good times because he just stood around and went to funerals. I mean, everybody knows the vice president doesn't do anything. And on the other hand, he has to try and be his own man, which ultimately means saying that, well, I'm going to be different than my boss. So in good times, you're running against the good times. It just becomes a contradiction that's very difficult to overcome. The one exception was 1988 when George Bush, he ran, his basic campaign was, hey, I'm going to keep the good times rolling because it was really good times. And it was so good that people said, yeah, let's keep it going. And of course, the Democrats also ran, I would say up to this point, the worst candidate I've ever seen. I mean, Mike Dukakis was hilariously bad. I mean, even left-wing people made fun of him. I mean, Saturday Night Live used to make fun of him all the time. So, I mean, there was a lot of things fell in place. But generally speaking, vice presidents don't win. They might become president through death or, resignation or something like that. But, they don't typically do very well because, it's at that contradiction. You have to be your own person, but at the same time, you have to try and cling on to your boss's record. And it's a hard sell. And the problem that she has is that right now, the sort of thing that hangs over all of this like a fog is the concern about the decreasing competence we see. We see it everywhere. I run into this in my business life all the time. People constantly are talking about this problem of finding competent people and or dealing with competent people. It's a huge problem. I've been writing about the crisis of competence for 10 years now, and it's not getting better. And it shows up in people's radar when they see that, people changing tires at an airport on a Boeing airplane, the tire explodes and kills two of them. Or the Boeing airplane, the doors fall off of it mid-flight. This stuff keeps happening. It's part of what has really plagued the Biden administration, because back when they tried to get out of Afghanistan, which everybody thought was a good idea, they took what should have been a simple thing and screwed it up. And it just kind of reminded people, yeah, it's just, all the people in charge are screw ups. And Harris is now running in this atmosphere where people are concerned about the lack of competence. It's on the Gallup poll. I think I talked about it in the show last week, and I know I've written about it. It's like the number 3 item, general competence. People are concerned that their government, that people in charge are idiots. Well, that you run a woman who is, first of all, she repeatedly lied about the mental competence of her boss, and now she can't string a sentence together to save her life. It's just a really tough environment for her. In a lot of ways, the reason that no one else threw their hat in the ring to run this time is they all saw that this was just awful right now, to run as a Democrat. I think I compared her to Gerald Ford in 1976. She got the same problem. She didn't win the opportunity, and that weighs on people's minds. She was selected. They engineered her into this. She didn't have to run in primaries, and her boss is out of favor. And she's at the same time though, she's got to try to defend it, and she's got all these problems, and it's a compressed campaign. And of course, Gerald Ford had the problem is that he didn't have a constituency either. There was really nobody that was willing to say, yeah, he's our guy. And I think that's what Harris is struggling with right now, is that, this media campaign is great. It's fantastic. It works really well. It's cheap. It doesn't cost a ton of money. It's effective. It won the internet for 30 days or whatever it's been. But when she gets back to, when the campaign moves from the internet back to the meat space, all these problems are still there. They haven't gone away.
I think that you're right. This kind of insane media push, right? And it's kind of funny. I keep talking about them because even a month later, they sound so incredibly out of touch, right? The whole Kamala is brat, JD Vance's weird saga, right? Which are hopefully sentences that will become increasingly incomprehensible to viewers as they get kind of further and further into the future. But there was nothing to it, right? It was pure media spin. The message behind both of those is basically it's high school girl stuff. It's right. We're cool. The people we don't like are gross weirdos. That's it. And okay, right. Let's game that out. 4 weeks later, that's vanished, right? Like vapor. And this bump Kamala had. Well, first, she has a big dip after the DNC, right? The DNC was a disaster. And I'm not saying that as a partisan. Look, I've never voted in a presidential election. I will vote for Trump this time. It'll be my first vote. I'm not a MAGA person, but it was a disaster. And now, actually, just today, we've reached the inflection point, right? It has gone back to exactly what it was before that push. And don't get me wrong, right? The Democratic Party controls the media, maybe not explicitly, but they call the shots. So they can keep doing that. But I think there's the core problem that Kamala is a genuinely horrible candidate. So I want to pivot slightly to her running mate. Tim Walz, is that his name?
Yeah.
Okay. I always say it wrong because I have really no pre-existing thoughts about him whatsoever. But he's kind of an interesting figure because he really is the progressive vision of what a good white guy is, right? They did this video together where they're kind of in a very scripted manner joking around. And, they go through the kind of traditional white guy joke that you've heard. I mean, it was hackneyed 30 years ago, right? Oh, I'm a white guy from the Midwest. I put mayonnaise on my tacos. I don't like spicy food. I mean, it's effectively a minstrel show for white people, right? He's kind of jugging and jiving to appeal to his masters, right? You see the same thing with, him out in the field, right? He's a hunter. And then look, like I don't want to get too into kind of gun autism, but if you look at the gun, it's like a incredibly heavy, incredibly expensive, like $10,000 trap shooting shotgun.
Yeah,
right?
from Italy. Yeah.
That's not what you'd use to go shoot ducks, right? When you dig even further, it's very clear that one, this guy has no appeal whatsoever, but two, he really is like the ideal version of what a white man is supposed to be in kind of modern progressive America, right? A torchbearer for a younger, kind of more diverse candidate. And I just don't see him going anywhere.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, I've been calling him Elmer Fudd for a while, but it's interesting about this whole how they marketed him in Minnesota. Way back when, I'm pretty sure it was Mark Warner ran for Senate, or maybe he ran for governor. Maybe he ran for governor in Virginia. He was governor, right, in Virginia? I think he had been governor.
Yes, he was. He also had this is just an anecdote. He has the honor of having quite possibly the best election song ever, which I cannot play, but he basically just got a bunch of good old boys to write him a bluegrass song. It's actually pretty good. But anyway, back to you.
Well, I was doing business in Virginia, and local business guy. Well, I mean, super connected business guy, super connected in the Democratic Party. And he took me for a ride to see some of his properties he was developing or something like that. And in the back seat of his car, he had all this, the samples of promotional material that they were going to use for the Warner campaign. And it had him posing in the Elmer Fudd costume out in the field with the shotgun. And I think he had, there was one where he's sitting there, he's got Blaze Orange on, he's got his dog with him, and then, all that kind of stuff, right? And I forgot the guy. There was a guy, I forgot his name, some sort of consultant. He was really kind of an eccentric guy. It was his idea, that they're going to sell, they're going to trick the good old boys, Republican voters with this costume act, this presentation. And, obviously it worked. But they tried doing it later in 2004 with John Kerry. They dressed him up as Elmer Fudd. And of course it didn't work because John Kerry was just terrible at it. But they keep doing the Elmer Fudd act because it worked back in the Bush years. It worked as a way to kind of undermine conservative support in certain rural areas. I mean, it worked once, it's like every other trick. It works once, you get fooled, you don't fall for it again. But apparently they pulled this with Walz in Minnesota. I started laughing because that one picture they had him in his Elmer Fudd outfit with his, $10,000 shotgun. You look at this, I'm like, wait a second. I'm pretty sure that was the picture they used for Warner. And I went online trying to find any old Warner, campaign stuff, but I didn't find it. So, but it just kind of tells you, the people behind this, they're extremely devious. They think about how to trick people. It's all about, coming up with some new narrative, some new character, some new way to deceive the public. And it's all kind of coalesced into this really fantastical Harris Walz campaign because, the real Walz, he's like 80% of the Walz that they sold to people in Minnesota. Yeah, he was in the military. No, he wasn't in a war zone. He kept always kind of saying things that make you think that he was in combat. Well, it turns out that never happened. He wasn't really that guy. He'll say to people, well, as an old football coach, well, it turned out he volunteered for a year or two. He wasn't really a football coach. It's everything about this guy is kind of like this. And, of course, bringing him on a national stage, now people look into this and you can kind of see it. But Walz is such an odd guy because he's like David French. He's like, there's this weird sort of old white guy that I run into not regularly, but on occasion, in that, it's almost like they hate themselves. They embrace all these old white women politics, but they're a white dude, they grasp onto all this really crazy liberal stuff. And I just don't know how these people, I just don't understand them. I mean, what's the point of this? Why did they do this? How do they find this personally fulfilling? I mean, I understand a guy like Walz, maybe had to do it to win election in Minnesota. Maybe, I don't know. But apparently he was doing this act before he got into politics. So he's just an odd guy. Men look at a guy like Walz and say, that's not a guy you can ever trust. He's very off-putting to normal males. Maybe he plays well with females. I don't know. But that's the problem with this campaign, though, is if you have a vice president who plays to the same audience that Kamala Harris is playing to, this very narrow, excessively online, unmarried, childless female. Well, you're not going to win an election based on that demographic.
I think that and maybe this is too tinfoil hat. So feel free to call me on it. But I have some contacts in the finance world, right? Very influential guys. And, one of the things they've talked about is that, there's likely to be sort of a worsening recession over the short term, right? We're not talking Mad Max, but things becoming uncomfortable, right? That trend will continue probably to, kind of a pain point. And, this guy was saying one of his theories is that basically the Democrats don't want 2024 or they don't want they don't want this election because there's a likelihood that the economy kind of blows up in, the president's face and they don't want to be the one, holding the bag. And, okay, maybe you don't believe that. But to me, it does seem like kind of similarly to what you saw with the conservatives in the UK, that the Democrats don't seem to be trying their hardest for this election. And I think one of the leading indicators of that is look at the candidate quality. Like, look, I hate Hillary Clinton, right? She's a horrible person, but she's an A-lister, right? That name has been around for a while. She can generate a lot of heat. Same thing with Joe Biden, right? Joe Biden's been around forever. But Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, these are backbenchers, right? These aren't real serious hitters. Do you think there's anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's kind of, there's a life cycle to a cycle within a party. back in, say, the 1970s, and I mean, I wasn't around then, but, the energy was all in this conservative movement that was building up within the Republican Party. They had all these really great candidates and great public speakers and intellectuals and all this stuff. And then it burst into the scene in the 1980s. But it also did this at a time when the left was exhausted intellectually, emotionally, generationally. A lot of the candidates that were running were really just incredibly awful. People forget this stuff. I mean, I remember Walter Mondale being the presidential candidate. I mean, you would rather gouge your own eyes out and rip your ears off than sit and watch Walter Mondale talk about anything. I mean, it was just awful. And it was just, they had the same problem. But then the Republicans had this problem. They ran out of gas too. They just didn't have anybody. So there is kind of a seesaw effect here between the parties. And right now the Democrats are down for sure. But I also think that, we're at a sort of an end cycle here, this post-Cold War cycle. Neoliberalism, neoconservatism, they've all run out of gas. I mean, Trump is a symptom. The reason that Trump exists is because the neocons, they wore the conservative movement like a skin suit. They directed it into things that people didn't generally want. People got wise starting at the end of the Bush years. And the Republican Party, the old Republican Party, the conservative movement is running on fumes. I mean, they got nothing. They're the Project 2025 business out of Heritage is an effort to try and glom onto this populist energy. But, even the populist energy is kind of misdirected. People are just pissed, basically. They don't, the average white person in America doesn't have a political party that represents their interests. So they're kind of, they're angry about it, but they don't have a way to talk about it. They don't have a language for it. They don't have a channel for that anger to flow into. So it kind of flows into Trump by default. But the same problem is happening on the Democratic side, I think, too. I think, I keep coming back to that Loudoun County revolt. I spent a lot of time looking into that because I think this is happening in a lot of places. I think a lot of upper middle class white people are looking around and thinking that we might have bigger problems than just Trump. We have other stuff. And certainly rich people, look, there's a lot of bad paper in the system. I don't know how much you know about finance, but there is a lot of really bad credit floating around in the system. The global financial arrangements are changing, and it doesn't appear as if right now anybody in Washington understands what the hell is happening. And, the smart money, the guys who are on Wall Street, I mean, they probably do know what's happening, and they probably understand that there is going to be a fair amount of pain as we transition out of the post-Cold War period into whatever we're going to call the next phase. But, there's across the spectrum, the people that are capable of thinking about this stuff are all looking around and saying that, we have a problem. And there really isn't anybody who is capable of addressing it within the sort of establishment system. Trump, for all his faults, does talk with some sort of, with a degree of clarity about some of the issues, but otherwise there really isn't a lot of options. There needs to be a great regrouping right now for not only just the Democrats, because again, they don't have any, their candidate pool is terrible. I mean, look around. I mean, Gretchen Whitmer, I don't know how old you are, but when I was a young guy, back like in my 20s, late 20s, we used to have a thing called cougar bars, right? Gretchen Whitmer is the kind of woman that would be at a cougar bar. That's what she looks like. Every time I see her, I just start laughing. She's lost a bunch of weight. She's gotten into the gym. That's what she looks like. She's not somebody you make president. I mean, or governor for that matter. Gavin Newsom, if you watch this guy speak, he's terrible. He's awful. I mean, he's boring. It sounds like listening to your accountant. You can go through the list of their A-listers and they sound like, C-listers from even 10 years ago or 15 years ago. So it really is it's a big problem. They've got this, they've got to have a reset. They've got to kind of rethink things. They got to recruit new people. They got to find new ways to, market themselves. And I'm not entirely sure it's going to happen without a lot of pain, because I think, for 30 years now, we've had a set of financial arrangements which are peculiar. They're not normal. the rest of the world was kind of just allowing us to lead them around, and now they're not. So there's a lot of stuff going on, and kind of getting back to what your point was, is that I don't think they're deliberately laying down. I just don't think they have a choice. They're just running out of good options right now.
Yeah, it's actually why, in the grander scheme of things, because I really share your analysis there, that to me, I'm voting for Trump because I have to live here, right? There's really nothing past that, right? Which is in the short to medium term, which will make my life better. I think that, don't get me wrong, I'd love to be proven cynical on this point, right? I'd love for, in 4 years, me to look back at this and say, oh, I can't believe I was so cynical. I was so black-pilled. But to me, I don't really see Trump fixing this at all.
No.
What I do see as kind of an interesting development is look at the people who are supporting Trump, right? Who kind of thrown their weight behind him. This election, the last one. Well, okay. I mean, we have, he's got AIPAC back, right? He's got Miriam Adelson, and I don't like those guys. I don't support the causes they do. And fair enough. But also you have this kind of new kind of tech elite forming behind Trump. Obviously the ones you always hear about are Thiel and Musk, right? Those are the big ticket guys. Yeah, I think that we've kind of forgotten about Vivek Ramaswamy, right? Who sort of served as, a Trump stand-in. And then as soon as Trump announced he was out, well, he drops out of the race. And, we can see that they have an inside seat because, that's where Vance comes from, right? He's connected to those guys. Now, that goes a little bit deeper, right? And actually, this is another reason I think shenanigans are less likely. You have Mark Zuckerberg, right? The CEO of Facebook, who was very much involved in the last round of shenanigans, basically saying, just in the last couple of days, 1, yes, that happened. 2, I'm sorry. And 1, I won't do it again. I think I got my numbers wrong there, but my point stands. And look, this doesn't mean that Mark Zuckerberg is suddenly my best friend, but it seems like we're seeing a new power block emerge. Now, I don't think this is the sort of power block that rejuvenates America, right? That takes us back to this kind of golden imperium. But there's competence there. There is energy there. And, if nothing else, I think that's a sector to watch.
Yeah, I completely agree with this. I mean, look, in 2016, Trump had no elite support. There were no billionaires signing up for Trump. I guess maybe Peter Thiel to some degree, but Thiel's an interesting character. I have some indirect dealings with him, and I don't think he's as politically savvy as people think, but that's a topic for another day. But Musk, who I think is to a great degree politically naive, but he's getting smart fast. But this is not a guy who is naive about the kinds of people who dominate politics. He's made all his money off of politics. People don't realize this. Most of his fortune comes from doing business with governments and getting government favors. The whole, Tesla wouldn't exist without enormous subsidies from government, and not just the United States government, the Chinese government, the EU. This is a guy who understands the system and how to manipulate it. And I think his great concern about what's happening is a signal to the other oligarchs that it's okay to start questioning these hired men we have in the managerial class. What the hell are these guys actually doing? And so I do think there's something happening here. Now, it could devolve into civil war, is always a possibility, but it's also possible that there's a reform movement afoot. Look, back in the 1970s, wealthy people, corporate interests, it was obviously a different world. They started to react not to the cultural stuff, but to the financial problems. They looked around and they saw that the money arrangements in the world were a problem. They saw the revolution coming with semiconductors and the microprocessor. There's a book I always recommend to people. It's called The Money Game, and the guy wrote it under a pen name. It's written in the 1960s about he wrote under the pen name Adam Smith. You read the book, it predicts everything that was going to happen with computerization in the financial markets. It's really it's a wild book to read. because you read it, you realize it's written in the 1960s and it uses a lot of the sort of madman type language. But all the predictions about what would happen in the 70s, 80s, and 90s are all right there. And it's a great insight as to how the people at the very top of the system do know a hell of a lot more about what's coming down the road than the rest of us do. And, these people saw this and they started to react to it. And we ended up with the conservative revolution with Reagan and all that stuff. But we also wound up with a revolution in the financial relations, for the money relations of the world. You got the Palace Accords, you got the Louvre Accords, you got the, 1974, you got the agreement with the Saudis that established the petrodollar. I mean, these were revolutionary changes. You had the beginning of, deregulation that started. We're deregulating. I think it was Ma Bell got broken up and then the airlines got deregulated. All this stuff happened. It was because the economic elites looked around and said, we have a problem. The system that we have is not working and it's becoming dangerous. And so they pushed through a huge reforms. And that may be happening now. We might be on the cusp of it. The difference is that, 1970s America was a different country demographically than 2020, 2024 America. So, it's not a perfect analogy, but yeah, I mean, I do think that the rich people are concerned. I mean, look, if you're Elon Musk, you're a Mark Zuckerberg, hell, you're a guy who's a president of a financial institution. You got to be looking at Durov getting arrested, the guy who runs Telegram in France, and think, we have a real problem. I mean, that has got to be sending off loud alarms in every mansion around the globe. You don't arrest billionaires like that. It just doesn't happen. Not in the West, it is not supposed to happen that way. Even though he's Russian and all that other stuff, it should never have happened. They didn't arrest the guy, Abramovich, who owned, was it Manchester United, the British soccer team? I mean, he's a Russian oligarch, and they didn't arrest him. Why are they arresting this guy? Something's changed. Brazil is now threatening Musk over censoring X. So yeah, I mean, I've kind of rambled here a little bit. Sorry about that, but it's a great topic. It's something that I think is happening, but you can't be sure where it's going to go. I think the economic elites, the oligarchs, are becoming increasingly concerned about what the hell's going on, and they don't worry about transgenderism and all that stuff, but they do worry about rich guys being arrested, financial system being shaky, the competency of the political class. So, we could find ourselves in very interesting times. Now, I just wish I was 20 years younger, because if it's going to all fall apart and there's going to be, people are going to be running around in the streets with guns, I'm too old to do that now.
Yeah, I think this might be a paraphrase from your show, right? But, there's this idea that, nothing changes until rich people get hurt. And I think that we're starting to see that. You cited obviously the regime coming after Musk, and I really do think that was a breakwater moment. One of the other names that gets thrown around in the mix here is Erik Prince, and Erik Prince really got screwed over by the government. Obviously, he's kind of a shady guy. He was involved with Blackwater. I have some personal contacts, right, who are friends of his, and they speak very well of him. But nonetheless, right, take a perfectly neutral view of the man. He is extremely wealthy, extremely competent, and extremely well connected. And the State Department screwed him over for basically no reason, right? For those who aren't familiar, effectively the State Department said, hey, can you send us some bulletproof vests? And then sued him for sending them bulletproof vests without their permission, right? That's effectively what took down his company, right? Which of course is incredibly Kafkaesque and absurd, but that's a man who has an axe to grind with the government, to put it mildly. Now Musk, who's, incredibly wealthy and powerful, has an axe to grind. And I think one of the reasons you see, all of these tech CEOs and again, these finance guys like, the CEO of Chase Bank, the CEO of Blackstone, I think, not BlackRock, basically aligning behind Trump, is that I think for a lot of people, it's this kind of looking around saying like, wait a minute, I could be next, right? They could come after me for, largely conflated reasons. And like you said, I don't know where this goes. I don't think any of these people are our guys, But at the same time, to be honest, I'd rather just have a government that works, that functions at the barest level, so that I don't have to, sincerely worry about, my safety or, things that would be almost, unthinkable 30, 40 years ago in America.
Yeah. I tell you, in my business life, I've always kind of chuckled because often deals that I've been involved with, and, when I was a younger guy in corporate America, I worked on some substantial deals, and it was weird how they kind of took a life of their own in a way, in that you went into it, you thought you understood all the facets of it. Everybody you were working with thought they understood it. And stuff just starts to happen. And before long, you're not really working on the deal you thought you were. You're working on something else. Sometimes it gets really big, it becomes more complex. And it's just, we as human beings, we're limited, and we can't see around corners. We don't always see all the facts, and we can't think beyond a few moves and, all that kind of stuff that people know. And you see this happen in politics. Donald Trump came down that elevator in 2015, not expecting to be president of the United States. That was obvious. But he wound up saying things about immigration in particular that caught fire. It was like he threw a cigarette out of his car and set the prairie on fire. I mean, he didn't intend to do it. It wasn't what he was thinking about. It wasn't a plan. It just sort of happened. My analysis of Trump in his first year is that a first term as president was he just got swept up. It was, this is a guy who had thrived his whole life in chaos, but was unprepared for the degree of chaos that had happened. This thing that happened. Glenn Youngkin winning the governorship. I watched that, and look, I have some idea what Glenn Youngkin was like before all of a sudden things just kind of took off, and he was just riding the tiger. And it changes you when you're in that kind of circumstance, when all of a sudden, you go from 0 to 1, to quote Peter Thiel. It changes how you look at the world. You look at things in a different way. You look at yourself in a different way. And I think that's happening with Musk. I think it certainly happened with Trump. I think it's happened a second time with Trump when he got shot. I think that changed his demeanor since then has been different. And you can see it. He's much more serious, and he may be overthinking things a little bit, but I think he had that moment where he realized that, hey, wait a second, I'm a world historical figure. My life now has meaning beyond just being good at the stuff I enjoy being good at. And I think, that could be what happens with us as a country as a whole. All these rich guys are looking around, they're seeing these problems. They look at the rampant dishonesty, this arresting of Durov. I cannot believe they did that. That is such an insanely stupid idea. Because it's not, who cares about Durov? Who cares about Telegram? If it went away, the world wouldn't change that much. It's the symbolism of it. It's what it appears to be. And there's so many things like that. And it's representative of this sort of dishonesty of the managerial class. And we look at these people as our bosses, but the rich guys, the oligarchs, the guys like Elon Musk, the guys like Mark Zuckerberg, they look at these people as their employees. And all of a sudden they find, imagine yourself, you're running a company, and all the guys who, or you're not running the company, you own the company, and you have a meeting with all your C-level people, and they're all lying to you. What do? Well, you get rid of all of them. You start thinking about how I get rid of all of them and I bring new people in. And that may be what's happening with a lot of these guys because of the constant lying, the dishonesty, the unwillingness to abide by the rules. So, we could be in for some very interesting times. And you know what? It may be necessary. Interesting times might be the kind of thing that fixes a lot of the spiritual and cultural problems that we have. You see, you see this stuff too. People talking about the fertility rate and the, loss of community and social capital breaking down and all that. Maybe we need a really serious crisis that focuses everyone's mind on what's important, and a ruling class that is doing it at the same time we are. Maybe that's just a necessary thing to have the renewal that we're going to need, not just as a country, but as a civilization.
I've thought the same thing, that, there's this desire to sort of, have your cake and eat it too. right? This desire to go to become, a vitalistic living society again without going through anything unpleasant. And I'm not entirely sure that that's how it works, right? Forgive me for a minute, right? But this is something that you see all the time in, both the entire Western canon, right? But then in scripture, right? This idea that, that a people kind of falls away from, the path, right? They reject God. They do something shameful, and they need to atone for that, right? There's a blood price that needs to be paid. And I don't want to take this into an overly chin stroking direction, but I think that applies to us as well. That these sort of interesting times are probably the only way we get to a society that has a reason to exist again. And I think that, the kind of like endless chanting about 1776 shall commence again from the, sort of the morbidly obese boomers, I think is probably a little bit of wishful thinking. But Z-Man, we are coming up on time. I really enjoyed this conversation. It went different places than I thought, and I enjoyed it quite a bit. But if people want to find more of you and your work, what's a good way for them to do so?
Just go to thezman.com. That's the easiest place. All my links are there. I even have links to John Darbyshire stuff. He's one of the old graybeards who I have a tremendous amount of respect for. I wouldn't be here without John Darbyshire. So I'm now that VDare went out of business. I'm now supporting and distributing John's weekly podcast. And if you want to hear a real old head, a guy who's been at this, the guy who actually coined the term dissident right. If you want to know what the old guys are thinking, then just go to thezman.com. I put his show up every Saturday morning.
Well, I'll be sure to link to that. I actually didn't realize you were publishing his work now. I'm not as familiar with his sort of recent work, but there are a couple of John Darbyshire essays that are all-time classics. I'm definitely going to have to check that out. All right, Z-Man, welcome back to the Jay Burton Show. How you doing, man?
I'm doing very good. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you back on. I always enjoy our conversations quite a bit. And I will say for my audience, the technical issue has been solved. So you will be hearing me out of 2 ears instead of only one. Sorry about that. Just had some hardware issues that have been resolved. But obviously, I'm not just here to talk about my inability to make a podcast after almost 300 episodes. I'm here to talk with you, Z-Man, about kind of the current state of things, right? Because I think one of the most interesting developments of the Trump presidency has been this kind of bizarre divide among our circles, where either you see people who've essentially been brought back into the fold, right? They are full on, MAGA Republicans. Trump is going to save the world. Trump is going to, get us to that ideal state. Or alternately, and I think you see this particularly among the European chapter of the right, this kind of endless doom and gloom, right? Old Zion Dawn is back. And that's not really how I view things, right? I view this as, while certainly a win, a conditional one. It's not the end. And I'm curious, right? Where do you find yourself falling, and what do you see as being kind of the relevant developments?
Well, broadly speaking, right-wing politics, or what we call the right in the United States, has always had an element of people who like being a medium-sized fish in a very small pond. They carve out these sort of little sort of subcultures where, they get to be the star of the event that has 25 people show up, or, the online group that has, 50 people who listen to the live stream, that kind of stuff. And they often act like the kinds of people who found a new band or a cool little restaurant. They love the fact that nobody goes there or nobody really listens to it. And so once it starts getting popular, they feel as if, oh, well, it's sold out. It's not the same as it used to be. And that's how they look at a lot of this politics. I mean, because look, many of the things that were only said in, banned live streams and banned internet places are now coming out of the mouths of the president, the vice president, and his people. I mean, some of the things that JD Vance says were things that got you thrown off of Twitter 5, 6, 7 years ago. And so, there's a lot of good stuff happening, but these people look at that and they they don't want to be winners. I hate to use that word, but there's some part of their identity is in failure. And there's some beautiful losers. I mean, this is what Sam Francis wrote about 1 million years ago, and that it's the people who just sort of want to cling on to either their tiny little piece, or maybe they cling on to the past. That's just who they are. And so success really is actually the worst thing that can happen to them. But there's also people, I think, that just have an obsession over one particular issue, and you can never be satisfied with it. It's a very weird thing. Trump, when it comes to our greatest ally, he gives a lot of lip service, but he doesn't deliver a lot. If you actually read the Israeli news or listen to some of the Israelis, they kind of think Trump is selling them a false promise. They don't really think that Trump actually delivers much for them. It's odd in a way. The people who are always complaining about Trump in our side, in America, complaining, oh, Trump never follows through with stuff. Well, we're not the only ones. He kind of gyps every once in a while, overselling things. But, if your only issue, the only thing you care about is getting up in the morning and finding out what's going on with Israel, well, you're never going to be happy. So, there's those two kinds of groups. But I think there's people who just I don't really think they understand the nature of the problem. We're not changing policy here. We need to change a culture and an economy, a political economy in Washington. This whole blob business where you had $40 billion of USAID money, tens of billions of dollars, probably as much, maybe $40, $50 billion coming out of individual agencies as grants and subscriptions and all kinds of ways to send taxpayer money into these not-for-profits and NGOs and think tanks and all media companies. And then, they use a lot of this money to harvest and control the private money. I mean, you're talking about $100 billion a year. I mean, this is an enormous amount of money feeding into this system, all of which was used to bribe politicians, control the media, control access to power, to fund people who run around looking for, oh my goodness, the Z-Man said something untoward towards this group. Aha, let's destroy his life. Let's go after this guy. All the doxing people, all these guys, we're all funded with this stuff. And going after that political economy is huge. That is an enormous change because, that's why everyone's so terrified in Washington right now. And once you dismantle, you stick a knife through the, you put the ice pick in the head of the blob, so to speak. All of a sudden, lots of other things become possible. The world really does change, but it's not going to change overnight. It just means that you now have an opportunity to organize and work hard and try and affect change. The biggest problem we've had over the last 30 years, probably most of my adult lifetime, is that there's been no way for normal people to participate in politics and get a positive result. You can vote yourself silly, and you just kept getting the same crap over and over again. All of a sudden, things are starting to change. You can actually expect something other than the usual crap. So there's a lot of good stuff here, but there's always a lot of people who just don't understand that. They look and say, well, Trump promised mass deportations. They don't know what that really looks like, but they feel they're not getting it. So, he ripped us off again, So, there's always going to be that element. There's always going to be people who like that. But I think most people understand that we're in the middle of something different. This is very different. I don't want to use the word revolution, but there are things happening now that I remember paleocons talking about when I was a young man, which trust me, it was a long time ago. And no one has ever thought were possible. They laid off 90% of the staff at the Department of Education. Republicans have been running on that for, I don't know, probably since Jimmy Carter. And all of a sudden this happened. Now, it doesn't mean that they, saved all $230 billion or whatever. And most of it is student loans, but still, there's a lot of good stuff happening. And, we'll see what happens. We'll see if it actually goes and continues on the direction it is. But right now, if you're not feeling pretty chipper about the state of things, you'll never be happy. You're someone who will just be miserable for the rest of your life.
Well, and I'm glad you brought up, that idea of changing what is perceived to be possible, because one of the strongest weapons in our enemy's arsenal is the ability to set the null hypothesis, right? What is seen as normal and acceptable. And if anything, right, British politician Tony Blair was a master of this, where he would basically push for some radical change, but cast it as if, this is simply, the decision has been made, right? The conversation is already over. And, you see this in the way, for instance, that the UK banned guns, right? He expressed that as if, that was an issue that had already been decided, right? The voice of history is spoken and this is done. And, for a long time, this is something Republicans have been fighting up against, right? You can, see over and over and over again, where Republicans effectively have, adopted the framework of their enemies, right? Okay, well, this is already decided. Roe versus Wade is already decided. We're simply managing, everything after that point. And, the ability to, as the meme says, right, simply do things is huge, right? I sort of echo your points about Israel. To me, look, like, obviously that is a heavily embedded interest group, right? One of the most powerful lobbies, as, John Mearsheimer will tell you. But it is not the sole determinant factor in politics, right? That is not, it's not like you solve that issue and then everything goes away. It's a complicated system. And to me, right, I keep going back to, the binary choice, however much a choice that was, is, up for debate between, Harris and Trump. And look, as someone who actually lives here, I don't regret my choice, right? That was a pretty easy choice to make. And, you mentioned the incredible, corruption of all of this, right? The fact that, most of the opposition to things that we think was not organic. It wasn't real. It wasn't, as it is often presented, the inevitable conclusion to that argument. It was simply, right, government fiat. They just gave money to people who had views that they liked, right? The BBC got money, Axios got money, as you mentioned, but, even people like Politico, right, who was in charge of so-called fact checking. And to me, right, it very much reminds me of, Curtis Yarvin's point, where he says, people look askance at the Soviet system, but, really we live in an economy or a society that's just as much controlled by the government. And people laughed at him right back in 2008 when he wrote it. But, you look at the receipts and it turns out that, he may have been underestimating it, right? It turns out that literally almost all of these people are getting, hundreds of thousands of dollars. Like the example that comes to mind is Christianity Today, right? One of these kind of like left-leaning evangelical newspapers. And, this organization swung hard to the left, really post 2020. And you'll never guess what happened just before that. They got $2 million from the federal government, right? It's amazing how that strategy works, right?
Yeah, the environmental groups were all paid off with donor money. It's all this stuff gets laundered. I wrote about this 10 years ago, maybe, I don't know, it's been a long time now, but about how this laundering works. Now, I think I did a show on this recently about how this, but I don't know. Yeah, honestly, I produce so much content, I kind of lose track of what the hell I'm doing sometimes. But there's this money laundering is really what this system was. No one really could know for sure. So it felt like community money to people. One of the weird things about, and this was true in the Soviet Union, and honestly, it was true in pre-revolutionary France. You see these phenomena show up where all of a sudden a culture, and there's everywhere around you in the elite is social proof. And it just feels like you have no choice but to go along with what everybody else is doing. And because it seems like, well, you're getting finance from this guy and he thinks this, and you're getting a job maybe from this guy and he thinks this, everywhere you turn, everything you count on in terms of your lifestyle and how you live your life is, all these sources all seem to be on the same page. Well, it turns out that they're all being paid by the same source. So sure they are, but it doesn't seem that way to you. If these people were actually getting a direct government check instead of getting, support from people who seem to be their friends, they probably would have been, some of them would have been more suspicious. But it just kind of feels like, hey, everybody's doing this. And it's, this social proof that's developed around it. It's exactly how the Soviet system worked. They had this thing called the embankment to set up apartments that were up on this hill and on the river in Moscow. And all the apparatchiks, the new class, they lived there. And it became a part, it became a new class. They got class consciousness. And that literally is what's happened in Washington. It's the embankment now. It's this, or Versailles. There's another example, where all the royals, all the aristocrats live in this one area, isolated from everyone else. And so it's very easy to control the mental space they live in. And that really is what's happened in Washington. That's why, all these right-wing people, supposedly right-wing people, they would start out working for a National Review or the Federalist or, Cato or, these different operations, and before long they're at the Washington Post or the New York Times sounding just like the people they used to oppose. Like, how is this happening? Well, they're all their friends. They just evolved with their friends. I mean, Pat Buchanan talked about this back 1992 is famous at the time. He said, you elect your congressman, he goes to Washington. Before long, he turns into a native of Washington. And that's exactly what's been happening. But it was all made possible by billions and billions and billions of taxpayer dollars financing this political economy that was Washington. And it's going to be interesting to watch. When you're talking about laying off 20% of the federal workforce, which is what they're actually doing right now. They're laying off a lot of people, but also piercing this, this blob and draining money out of it. I mean, I've often said that every mortgage payment in Washington, every college tuition payment, every college loan payment, every opportunity to get your kids into a good private school, all counted on nothing ever changing. And now everything's changing, which means a lot of mortgage payments aren't going to be made. A lot of houses are going for sale. It's going to be interesting to see what happens to the actual physical economy in Washington. People have been watching the real estate market to see what happens. And, we'll see how it unfolds. But, it's fundamentally altering how Washington operates because, without the billions and billions of dollars from the federal government, the machine stops. And again, that opens, it doesn't mean everything gets great and rosy and all the problems are solved. It just means that we live in a different world. Things are going to operate differently. And that's why, look, it's why the Democrats don't know what to do. The Republicans don't know what to do. These guys are poleaxed. I mean, Chuck Schumer, who is a vicious political animal, rolled over and asked Trump to scratch his belly over that continuing resolution. I've never seen anything like it. I mean, he looked defeated. And I mean, that alone, I mean, my whole life, Chuck Schumer has been a pit bull. And to see him like that, it really screamed at me that, man, something wild is going on in Washington right now. These people, it's not that they're terrified. They don't know what to do. They don't know how to respond. They don't know what to say. And that's all good. I mean, we're on the side that says destroy the status quo. So the status quo is being destroyed. Now, what comes after, we'll see. It could be worse, or it could be something we don't like. Who knows? But at least we've moved the ball down the field to this point.
Well, I'm glad that you brought up Northern Virginia real estate prices because I have checked and they are absolutely cratering. I mean, I think that the average home price in 1 week, and I haven't checked since then, had cratered almost $80,000, which is even in an area that's fairly well off, that's apocalyptic. And I just want to say I could not feel less sympathy, right? And I'll be honest, there's a part of this that, look, to me, there's a certain amount of cultural decline that I don't think we're going to be able to cheat our way out of, right? But given the choice between cultural decline with, the eternal HR state and watching these people have to squirm a little bit, I'll certainly take the second option, right? And, as you mentioned, these have been the things that the conservative movement has been trying to get done for years, decades. And the fact that, that so many changes were made so quickly and that, these people are basically in a tailspin, it's heady, right? It's easy to, to get swept away in it because, as you mentioned, these people they conceptualize themselves as a distinct class. They see themselves as better, as above people like you and I. And to realize how unstable that was, right? To realize that, you're effectively one stroke of a pen away from being a normal person. They don't seem to be coping with that well. And, again, I'm just going to repeat myself. I could not feel less sympathy.
Yeah, I'm not going to lie and say I'm not enjoying this. I often think about when I see one of them who are still on Twitter, moaning about how terrible things are, and I think, man, this is great. This is why why the Germans gave us the word Schadenfreude. We don't have a good word in English for it, but I find myself from time to time tempted to lick my computer monitor to taste the sweet, salty tears of these people. But yeah, look, at the end of, in a lot of ways, what we're going through here is the Cold War is finally ending. All the mechanisms that built up over this time to win the Cold War should have been turned off in 1992 with Bill Clinton. And actually, there was talk about that in 1992. But you know what? There was just too many good jobs at good wages, and instead they went a different way. And we've reached the end of that road. We're at the end of the unipolar moment, the post-Cold War, the end of history, all that other bullshit. And a lot of this stuff just has to be taken apart. And a lot of it is driven by the fact that our richest people, our oligarchs, it was not an accident that all the richest men and most powerful corporate leaders were at Trump's inauguration and made sure they showed up at Mar-a-Lago. They swung behind this guy because I think they realized that a lot of bad things were happening and they needed to head this stuff off. The country was in a lot more trouble, perhaps, than really we realized. And that's what this is all about. I've talked about it as, America Inc. is going through a resizing. The board of trustees, the board of directors, whatever you want to call them, they decided management was screwing up. We got enough. We got to change things. And they're bringing in new management. They're downsizing things, getting rid of certain departments. We're going to outsource certain functions back to the private sector. And some aspects will be sold off. And that's what's happening in foreign policy. Basically, we're going to privatize Europe. We're going to take it. We're going to set it up as its own thing and say they're on their own now. Go figure out how to be a civilization again. And that's a lot what's happening here. And there's longer cycles too. I've written and talked about this. If you go back and look at Nixon, a lot of the bad stuff that we have today that seems to be falling apart was started under Nixon. That's there's no question about it. The Paleos wrote a lot about this. The growth of the managerial state and that. But what we're going through, it's an interesting thing though. In the Cold War is important because at the end of the Cold War, Russia was a poor country, but was a lawful country, and then it became a poor country that was unlawful, and it reorganized itself, and now it's becoming it's back to being a lawful country, and it's slowly its economy. It's doing pretty well economically. The United States is a rich country that had become lawless. We don't realize just how lawless we were over the last 10 years. All the stuff they did to Trump, but, throwing these J6 people into dungeons. The abuses of these people's basic civil rights was just monstrous. No one talks about that too much. Fortunately, they've all been pardoned, but all kinds of things. There's just lots of terrible things that we're becoming lawless. And now I think we're going to go through this really rough period where we're probably going to get a little poorer. I don't think there's any doubt about it. The economy is going to have some difficult moments. But, if we can come back to being a lawful society again and having some sanity back to how our country's run, we'll do okay. We'll survive the transition. And that really is what we're experiencing now. We're at the beginning of this great transition out of this past. As I like to say it, we're about to join everybody else in the 21st century now. We'll stop talking about 1938, 1968, 1984, all these dates that just keep coming up over and over again. We'll finally be able to shut the door on that stuff. And that means we're also going to have to, we're going to have to develop a new set of values, things that are important to us, new customs and culture. You don't go back and say, oh, well, we're just going to go and adopt these old ways. It doesn't work that way. So it's going to be an interesting time. I say interesting, not necessarily good interesting. There's going to be some bad interesting as well, because a lot of the stuff we take for granted is going to be called into question. I say stuff, our values, our point in our lives as individuals, how we go about things, how we work, how we spend our money. A lot of stuff's going to change, and some people will do better than others.
Yeah, to me, and this might be recency bias, but if you could pin down a moment that it seems as if, the post-war consensus died, right? The so-called rules-based international order was, finally the nail was put into the coffin. It was, Trump and Vance's interaction with Zelensky. Because to me, and I know there was some coverage of this that, said it's all a game, right? It was a deliberate plan to create some kind of media spectacle. I don't believe that, right? To me, that seems as if, Trump and Vance, after a fairly long conversation, got rightfully very annoyed with the rat king of Ukraine. And in the week since, right, the discussion over, what will likely be a peace in Ukraine has basically just been between Donald Trump and the Russian government, right? There's no even fig leaf anymore that, Zelensky has a say in this matter. And look, like, I know that the Europeans are making noises. We will see what the Europeans end up doing. But I think that that's an interesting move, right? The recognition, which, let's be honest, may have always been true, that, really what this matters is this kind of conversation between, individual leaders of a nation, more so than this, system of, different UN security councils and all that. And I think that to a certain degree, it's a more honest view of it, right? It is how it has always happened, just kind of stripped of a certain level of nicety. And, when I look at this, right, the analogy to the late Soviet Union is kind of apt, because that was an aging system that no one really believed in anymore, but it just had this kind of momentum. And, I think that a certain part of the kind of like U.S. international empire faced the same problem, right? That it was out of date. It was kind of coasting on, the cultural ideas of a previous era, and it was floundering, right? And to me, and I could be wrong, but I think that in 20, 30 years, that will be seen as the kind of like emblematic moment of that shift.
Yeah, it's funny. I don't know. Recency bias is the right word. Because when a couple weeks ago, Paul Ramsey and I did a show on Reagan, and we both were teenagers when Reagan was riding high. And one of the things we talked about is that if you lived in that period, you thought, man, he's going to be on Mount Rushmore. He's up there. He's FDR, two great presidents of the 20th century, then Lincoln, and Jefferson, Well, I don't think about Reagan at all anymore. All these years later, I lived through it. So I should, getting into my geezerhood, I should be nostalgic for those days. Don't think about it at all. And, it's weird how that those things can happen. Stuff that's important in a moment can easily just disappear from the collective consciousness, and things that didn't seem all that important at the time can rise up. I think, right now, if I were going to guess at something that was sort of a pivot point, it's going to be the 2020 election. I think a lot of people, not just average Americans, but I think a lot of wealthy people looked at that and said, what the hell is going on here? Everything about that was shocking to a lot of people. Some, it was shocking for different reasons, but I think generally that people looked at that and said, you know what? We've become lawless. We're that's no different than the Senate assassinating Caesar in Rome. This is the break. And I think in the fullness of time, we'll look back and say that was the moment in which the economic elites, a lot of culturalists, a lot of people started talking privately that, hey, we've got a big problem here. Something's gone horribly wrong. And I think that may be it. I could be completely wrong, but I do think that turned out to be a seminal moment, because it's not just the election itself. I think it was also the treatment of the people, the attitudes. Just the sneering contempt of the average person by Washington. I think that shocked a lot of people. And, it was downhill ever since. That was really peak bad guys. It was peak, all the bad guys. That was their best time. And if you think about it, every month, every year from that point forward, things got worse and worse for the bad guys. When did Musk buy Twitter? Was it 2023, 2022, something like that's when it started?
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah. So, that there's another item you could point to and say that was a turning point. Because look, this is basically the richest man in the world saying, I'm going to buy one of the more influential platforms because I disagree with the politics, which happens to be the politics of the people in charge. that had to be a big message. If you're the second richest guy, you took notice. If you're the 20th richest guy, you took notice. So, you know, I mean, it'll be interesting to, you know, to see how people look back on it as how things change. But I do think, and it really brings up, actually, something just popped in my head, you know, as a good example of how you never know. When Trump came down that escalator, how many people thought he would be this world altering figure? You know, he would be this arguably in the running for one of the most important people in the last 50 years. I don't think anybody, I can't imagine anybody, not even Donald Trump, thought that he was going to be this seminal figure. When you look at the last 10 years, I mean, this man went from being an entertaining television and real estate entrepreneur to being the most consequential man in the lifetime of half the country. You know, I mean, you have to be old like me to think, well, there was more consequential people when I was younger. But, you know, I honestly, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if you asked me 5 years from now, I'll say, yeah, Trump was probably the most consequential figure in my lifetime because everything changed during that period. So I don't know. I mean, you can, you know, that pivot point of history, the inflection point, you know, 100 years from now, who knows what it will be. But, you know, but certainly right now, I think there's a lot of contenders. The 2020 election, Musk buying Twitter, Trump getting shot. I mean, think about the enormity of that. I mean, yeah, there's been a lot of history in the last 10 years.
Well, and look, I've joked a couple times that COVID was Vietnam for Gen Z, and they'll never shut up about it. But I do think there's something to that, right? That was, and it was hard to tell at the time, right? If that was, you know, as we heard from, you know, certain figures at the WF, if that was really the new normal, right? If they had done it, if they had, you know, they had managed to, you know, get the ring and become, you know, kind of like the eternal HR overlords of the world. And, you know, I think the further and further we get away from it, it seems as if, no, that was sort of a last gasp, right? That was a massive miscalculation, you know, basically putting all your chips on the table. And, you know, while it certainly had a short to medium term benefit, right? They were able to do a lot of things they wanted in a short amount of time. It cost them too much, right? They expended too much political capital, and now they're being punished for it. To me, I think that, you know, a neat heuristic, right, when kind of parsing if something is a win or not, is basically, you know, do your enemies get punished? Do your friends get rewarded? Right? It's not particularly sophisticated, but it works. And in this case, our enemies are certainly being punished, right? The unaccountable bureaucracy is being brought to heel. They are losing their jobs. They are, you know, at best being forced to retire early. At worst, like the Voice of America reporters, they're just, you know, thrown out on their ear. And the other side, right, are our friends being rewarded? I would say yes, right? Like you mentioned the Jan 6 protesters. And what's interesting about that is at first it was, you know, just pardons for the quote unquote nonviolent offenders. But when it actually came time for Trump to sign them, he just signed everyone, right? He let them all go. And look, like I am not the kind of person who would have really in any context been likely to be at an event like, you know, the electoral justice protest, but nonetheless, right, those are our people, right? Those are good, normal Americans. And the fact that, you know, they were freed from jail while all of these people are being fired, that's a strong indication that, you know, this was a good move for us, right?
Yeah. You know, it's again, you know, you can't expect, I some people, and I frankly, I've lost all patience with the black pillars, you know. Yeah. You know, there's times where when you lose or things are going bad, there's some for some reason or other, it feels good to kind of black pill. And I get that. We all do it. And, you know, you do it in everything. It's not just politics, but yeah, you know, you look at sporting events, people who watch sports, you know, there's a joke, you know, I can't wait for the game. And then 5 minutes later, I want to kill myself, fire the coach, you know. It's true. You know, it's kind of how we normally react. But right now in the balance, you know, things are really going our way. I mean, look, there was a time where a lot of people who were online, or I know people who dropped out of politics because they were terrified of the SPLC or any of these lunatics on Twitter getting their information and trying to destroy their lives. They could actually get people fired. Well, that doesn't happen anymore. that is over with. And those people have all been herded into, blue sky so they can be weird with each other and ignored by everybody else. It's kind of like it's become a zoo. People go over there, or some of these Reddit subreddits. You go, to just see what the crazies are up to. In China, they actually have tours where you can go right to the North Korean border and look and see the North Koreans. It's kind of like they treat it like a zoo, where you look over the border at the North Korean zoo. We have the same thing now with these crazies who were riding high just 5 or 6 years ago. So, I mean, there's just tons of good stuff happening. But again, it's not, we're not turning 50, 60, 70 years of mistakes over in what's it, Trump been in office, 3 months, 2 months? It's going to take a lot longer. This is a generational project that's starting now. Trump will hopefully hand the baton off to Vance, and Vance will continue this project. And, 2032, people will look back and be shocked that people actually were willing to tolerate things like COVID or, the doxing business, or, any of this kind of stuff. The world will be that much different. I mean, that's the hope. I mean, it's my hope anyway.
Well, to me, I actually think one of the most significant stories that has kind of fallen out of the discussion rather quickly is the so-called, quote, big balls situation, right? So for a little bit of background, right, there was this kid, I believe he was working with Doge, I can't remember what, excuse me, and he had an edgy Twitter account called Big Balls, where he would say things that, would be quite familiar to us and ours, right? It was an edgy Twitter alt. And this got revealed. It was brought to the attention of the government, and he was initially fired, right? That's actually pretty normal, right? That sort of thing has happened a number of times. But what's interesting is that JD Vance comes to this kid's defense. He basically says, we don't do this anymore. We don't, fire people because of, what our enemies think about them. And look, like, I've certainly been skeptical of Vance, but, that I found that kind of endearing. It's like, fair enough, right? And the fact that he is routinely denied the moral authority of his opposition, I think that's a very strong development, especially when you consider, right, that, regardless of your opinion on Vance, it's very clear that, he is being groomed as the successor, because in the Big Balls case, right, a reporter asks Trump, well, what do you think of this? And what does Trump do? Well, he looks to Vance and basically says, well, I don't know anything about it, but if Vance says it's a good idea, it has my seal of approval. Yeah. And it's done. And that's significant for a number of reasons, right? Because that is a signal from the very top that this kind of like eternal cancellation that has kind of plagued the right for decades, that will not be tolerated anymore. And look, well, obviously, the stated recipient for that was the activist left. I think the other people who were on notice of that was basically the conservative movement, right? You mentioned Francis earlier, and we all know what happened to him, right? He got canceled, not by, the left-wing radicals of his day, but, by Dinesh D'Souza, right? Within the house, so to speak. And so, again, I think that that's a very promising trend if that continues.
Yeah. Look, I will, I'll pat myself on the back for being early on Vance. But when he was third place in the polls, when he first launched his Senate campaign, I wrote an essay explaining why he was the best choice. And everything I wrote in there turned out to be right. And the reason is that Vance is an interesting guy. He's actually a real flesh and blood person. He grew up poor, and, he wasn't, living under a bridge or anything like that. But, he grew up working class, I guess is the way to put it. But he wanted to be one of the beautiful people. And he got there, and he realized that his only reason that they allowed him in was because he was really nothing more than a lawn jockey. He was this token they could put on their charm bracelets and say, oh, we helped a poor guy. We allowed a poor guy in. And I think it set off a revolution in his mind that said, I'm not going to live like this. I'm not going to be this kind of guy. And he's become a different person. And you could see it. I mean, I look, I say this as someone who kind of went through a very similar experience. So, I mean, I guess it's easier for me to recognize, but, he's just a different guy than he was, before he really kind of down this road. And he denies the other side's moral claims. He does, he is not, he's kind of like a guy who is outside of their religion and doesn't really care to know about their religion. And he has no interest in following the edicts of their religion. So he just, shrugs his shoulders when they say these things. And that's a great thing. That is a huge development. And I think in a lot of ways that Trump sensed this about Vance. He wasn't going to pick Vance until he got shot. And then he clearly changed his mind and decided to go with Vance for this reason. I think the best thing that ever happened is that happened to us probably is that they took a shot at Trump and missed. But I think, Vance in a lot of ways, what he stepped in and saved big balls, it was the end. It killed the whole doxing world. All these efforts. I mean, it was on thin ice right away. But when the second most important guy in the world says, "I don't care if you want me to fire this guy, we're not going to do it. Go screw." That's it. They lost all of their authority. They have nothing left at that point. And again, it's another good thing. I mean, it doesn't mean that you can go out in public and start using racial epithets without without consequence. We still have generally agreed upon behavior that you're not supposed to say certain things and do certain things in public and all that. I mean, and I don't think anybody should complain about that. But if you use some locker room humor in a private chat, or you get a little carried away on Twitter or something, well, the mature adult response now is reel it back in a little bit. Don't be so careless and move on. It's not this, oh my God, we've got to banish this person and destroy his life. Because I mean, think about how weird this is. That people were having their lives destroyed because of something they tweeted. I mean, think about just how insane that is. It's the kind of thing that you would expect in a grammar school where, all of a sudden, you did something wrong on the schoolyard. And so you have this mark on your permanent record and you're going to carry this with you into the next grades. You have this reputation forever. It's just childish and silly. So, I think, Vance has done it all a great service by what he did there. But I also think he's done a lot of other stuff like this too. I mean, he's what he's become is kind of like Peskov is or Medvedev rather. Probably like Medvedev for Putin. Putin is he kind of is the good cop and he tries to keep things light, and Medvedev comes out and just shreds people. And you see that happening. Trump's like the nice guy. And Vance is, he's the animal. He comes out and he breaks legs. So it's fun to watch. It's another part of all this that I'm enjoying a great deal.
Yeah, I think that one of the other things that's been kind of interesting is to watch the clash of Trump, right? Who seems to be committed to being this Article 2 executive, and the judicial branch. Most recently, I believe, I can't remember what his first name was. It was a Judge Boasberg, who I believe is Italian. I'm not entirely sure about that. Had basically issued this order saying, President of the United States is not allowed to deport Venezuelans to Venezuela, right? That is simply not allowed. And the reaction was quite interesting because Trump basically told him, to quote, to kind of paraphrase Andrew Jackson, you in what army, right? Which I think is another interesting thing, because if we compare and contrast to Trump round one, right, the 2016 presidency, there were a lot of really positive things said that just kind of sunk into the mud, right? They never went anywhere. They got endlessly wrapped up in court. And so I'm curious to see, similar to what we saw with the unaccountable bureaucracy, if there will be, some sort of, I guess, kind of settlement reached with the judicial branch, because at least up until recently, that was the kind of seat of final power in the U.S.
Yeah, I think, as we're recording this, I'm just looking on Twitter, and some lunatic judge has ordered Trump to said that all the end of USAID and all the firings and all that are unconstitutional, and everyone has to be hired back, given all their email back and everything else. Well, that's not going to happen. I mean, the buildings are closed, the computers are already headed for the dumpster. I mean, this is just silly, and that's the problem here, is that all these inferior court judges, these are public acts of piety. They're just making asses out of themselves and out of the system. And I think at some point this is going to head to a showdown. It has to happen to a showdown. Because look, we don't have a fourth branch of government called independent agency. That doesn't exist. Either these agencies report to and are in control of the executive, or they're in the under the control of Congress. That's it. I mean, there's only two choices. And of course, Congress set them up and put them in the executive. So it's tried. So it's headed to a showdown, I think, and a long overdue showdown. The courts need to have their sails trimmed, sure. And what's his name, Roberts? Roberts kind of signaled this. People read this the wrong way. He came out and he chastised Trump for saying that Boaz Berger should be impeached. And frankly, I would have no problem with them putting the FBI on this guy. He was up to his eyeballs in the Russian collusion hoax. He colluded with the FBI to get phony baloney FISA warrants. I mean, this guy is crooked. He should be on the list regardless of this stuff. And but that may be what has to happen. You rough up a judge this way with have the FBI carting out all of his electronics and everything else. That do the same stuff to him that he did to all the J6 people, to send a message to the rest of these judges. But I think it's going to end up in appeals, and I think at some point the court is going to clarify this stuff. And Roberts seemed to be signaling that, saying, "Look, instead of going to war with these inferior court judges, bring it to the appeal, and there you'll get remedy." And I think that's what he was signaling to the White House. And for the order of the country, it would be good if it happened. But if Plan B is rounding up some judges and sending them out to work camp somewhere in Louisiana, either way is fine by me. I don't care. I've lost all patience with the court system with these. I mean, some of these judges are just lunatics. I mean, they have no business being in the bar, much less as a federal judge. So, if Caesarism is the only answer, then that's what we'll have to do.
Well, Z-Man, I have no idea how you could call into question the legitimacy of a system where Judge Keontae Jackson is sitting on the Supreme Court.
She probably has an IQ under 100. I mean, if I actually went and looked at some of the things this woman's a moron. How in the hell she actually got it through law school? There's a thing that happens in the law. Someone told me this, that everyone suspects that there's certain people who somehow or other pass the bar, despite the fact that they probably couldn't ever score a competent enough score to pass the bar. They did just get passed through. And Crockett, that crazy woman who does the Ghetto Girl Act, the congressman from Houston, was it Jasmine Crockett?
Yes, I believe that's her name.
Yeah, I mean, she went to Fred's Law School. I mean, it was legitimately Fred's Law School. It's like a law school run out of an old grocery store. And somehow or other she passed the bar in Texas. But Jumanji Jackson. This is embarrassing. I mean, it's like putting a horse on the Supreme Court, or a block of wood or something. Come on.
Look, if we're really speed running, the sort of end of empire, I feel like getting a horse as president would be kind of our just desserts, right? I certainly couldn't be worse than the. Sorry, someone's driving a clapped out Honda outside my window here. But you couldn't. Right. When you compare that, right, having a horse as emperor to having a previous president who turns out signed all of his executive orders via robot, right? He couldn't even hold a pen. There's a question to be asked of what would be the difference, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we were talking earlier about these kind of inflection points, these things. There was a guy, Mark Andreessen, the guy who invented Netscape. Really one of the first browsers, and way back. And he's a big mover and shaker now. I think it's Andreessen Horowitz is his investment firm, and he talked about how back in like 2022, he had a meeting with the Biden administration about technology, particularly AI, and he came away, said, we have to stop these people. They're insane. And, he looked around and said, well, okay, Donald Trump is the only option here to try and put an end to this madness. I mean, you think about how terrible that meeting must have went with. You went in as a guy who was generally in favor of the Democrats and came out and said, I'm now a revolutionary. I want to overthrow the government. That must have been one hell of a meeting. But, a lot of this has, really due to the fact of putting a vegetable. I mean, you're a young guy. You don't remember this, but Joe Biden has been around so long that he was an old guy in Washington when I was a young guy. When I was a teenager, Joe Biden was in Washington.
I even remember ago. I'm the ancient history that is the Obama administration. And I mean, even back then, the running joke was he's kind of stupid, right? I mean, I think it was Barack Obama himself who said, I wouldn't trust him to make me a cup of coffee, right? He's not exactly a savvy political actor.
Yeah, back in he ran in '88, and it was terrible. But back in the '80s, I was a teenager. I worked for a congressman, and so I was just running errands and stuff like that. And I remember Joe Biden jokes. They used to talk about it was a running joke that he was so stupid, and he would tell these outlandish whoppers, these stories about his heroism and all this stuff. If he went on some congressional junket or something, he'd come back and he would talk about it, like he was on some James Bond adventure. He was just a complete ridiculous person. But the thing about it is that he was reliable to represent the credit card companies in Delaware, and they didn't care. Him being stupid was actually an asset. But so the idea of this moron, I mean, look, it didn't get any better. I mean, they actually cracked open his skull, I think, in the 90s and carved some stuff out that was growing in there. And then, he gets dementia and we make him president. I mean, a horse would have been a better choice because at least it would have been honest. And the horse, horses are noble animals. Biden is not.
I think one of the other interesting things to me, you mentioned Andreessen, who, let's put it this way, Andreessen is perhaps more involved in our circles than one would think. And, you have this kind of new cabal of, tech CEOs and entrepreneurs who have, kind of explicitly made their foray into politics, right? You have Elon Musk, who is, it's kind of a bizarre position, right? You have this sort of, he's technically the head of a government agency, right? But he pretty much seems to do whatever he wants. And look, like, I support what he's doing, I more power to him. But it is this kind of odd new development because, and maybe you can speak to this, but the interest groups in the Republican Party have remained remarkably stable, right? You have, a certain Mediterranean democracy. You have, MIC interests, which, let's be honest, aren't that separate. But now you have this kind of third group. And I would almost argue that there seems to be, whether you want to call it like the remnants of the deep state, the old WASP elite, which you can see in, for instance, someone like Tucker, right? And it seems as if, this new political coalition hasn't quite settled yet because, Musk gets to do almost everything he wants, right? He gets to fire whoever he wants. He gets to, gut whatever agency they point him at. But also, right, he got told no on H-1Bs. And so to me, I'm kind of curious to see what the final deal is and where those various interest groups kind of lie in the hierarchy.
Yeah, I tell you, in history, it's always been, the first forming of any sort of property middle class, that owns stuff. They've always tended to be extremely conservative. As it goes back to the Middle Ages and in support of the elites because they look and say, hey, we own a little property and they own a lot of property, but it doesn't matter. They're going to defend my right to own my little bit of property. And I don't want my little bit of property subjected to the mob. So it was always, historically the middle and the elite banding together to keep the lower classes under control. Then a weird thing happened in America in the 20th century where you get, that the political class in Washington bound the poor and the rich together, in war against the middle class. It's always the upper class and the lower classes against the middle class. And I think that's finally breaking down where, I'm perfectly fine with the rich guys doing whatever the hell they need to do, because at least I know who's accountable. This, for most of my life, I've never known who do you blame for this. Everything just gets worse, and both parties say, "Don't blame us. You voted for the other guy." It's just this ridiculous game that they play. And so having a guy like Musk or Zuckerberg or what's his name? What's the guy from Amazon? Bezos.
Bezos.
Yeah, him stepping on the people at the Washington Post and kicking them around. Good. I'm fine with it. Because look, if the rich guys take control of the government and they're going to run things, and if things don't go well, we know where to go. We know where they are. That's not going to be a problem. But when it's this collection of people that are just these faceless people in charge of committees and stuff, no one's ever accountable for anything. So I'm very much in favor of seeing these rich guys start to be more assertive. But it's interesting though, with the tech rich guys, is that so many of them had this libertarianish outlook. They adopted libertarianism in order to avoid the cultural stuff. But what they found through libertarianism is the door to our side. That, it's a weird thing. I've had a lot of former libertarians in my life who have come over the great divide to my kind of politics. And, it's not just the economic issues, it's the human capital issues, the hierarchical issues. They come to find out that, hey, wait a second, libertarianism explained to me that no, people are not all the same, and no, people can't be yeoman farmers and independent and all this stuff. You do need to control the masses. You need to have structures in place to do that, and so forth. And it's through the bad results of libertarianism that they discover things like hierarchy and the realities of human capital and end up on this side. And I think the same process has happened to these tech guys. I think they kind of went through the same door. And even though, they're not, they're not going to be showing up at the castle in Berkeley Springs for an event, they're not going to be upset that those events happen. They're going to be aware. They're going to know people who go to those events, and maybe they have their own soirees and where these guys meet. But it seems like the same process. I mean, I remember the first time I ever went to an event. I probably can't say the name of it. This is on YouTube, right? So, there were so many people who used to be libertarians, and they were red pilled by Ron Paul, of all things. And I think the same thing's kind of happened with the tech guys. But again, I'm fine. I'm okay with rule by billionaires. I mean, somebody's got to be in charge, and I would rather be a guy who can send a spaceship up to the space station and rescue people than some guy with a PhD in gender studies.
Well, and that's something that, I've sort of made peace with, right? That, simply due to the way humans are, there will always be an oligarchy, right? That's simply how humans organize themselves. But, you can make a quality judgment between those two. There are some elites I'd rather have in charge rather than others. And, to me, right, and I could be wrong, but I see this swap, if it can stick, as being beneficial. And it's not exactly a huge hurdle to clear, but the very fact that these people don't seem to hate me, to want me dead, and people like me to stop existing, that's a win, right? It's certainly better than the alternative. And that doesn't mean that this is like, the kind of like ideal philosopher king, right? Come down to lead us to heaven on earth. But one of the things I think about, and this is an interesting issue, is, the fact that the Trump administration and Musk have been making noises about South Africa. Look, I have, a lot of friends in South Africa. I've met with Ernst, who's recently on Tucker, Conscious Caracal, and I really like those guys. I have a certain affinity for them. The Dutch Calvinists are quite similar, to my people, how they view the world. So there's some kind of affinity there. But realistically, right, what has South Africa existed as in our consciousness, right? It's, it is the Rainbow Nation, right? We did it. We defeated racism. And the fact that you have, Marco Rubio basically kicking out the South African diplomat, basically offering, hey, South Africans are, experiencing ethnic cleansing. If they want to move to America, they can. that's a strong indication that, there's at least a desire to appear as if, the Trump administration doesn't hate white people, which again, like I've said, is not the biggest hurdle to clear, but, compare that to our previous demented executive. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I mean, look, Vance brought up the whole two-tier Keir Starmer, the two-tier system, and I mean, there's stuff coming out of this administration you never thought you would hear. It's the kind of stuff that got you fired from Twitter, or got you thrown off of Twitter, rather. So, it's a positive thing. I think, I think it was Charles Murray who said, this a long time ago, before he got all squishy. He said, inevitably, what's going to happen is that the elites are probably going to become more racially aware than any group in the country, because for them, it's the only way in which they can remain elites. It's a necessary reality they have to embrace. And I suspect that's really what we're seeing, is that, I've called it civilizationalism. We're not going to, these guys running around saying, oh, we want to have an ethno state or something like that. I just shake my head at it, because that's not who we're going to be in North America. What we're going to have is a civilization, and there'll be a hierarchy to that civilization, and we'll just accept it. And that comes with some duties. The people at the lower down they are, those are people who have to be looked after. You have to make sure their neighborhoods are as safe as you can make them, that they have food and the basics and so forth, and they have order imposed upon them. There are certain parts of this country that will just have to have a Hobbesian existence, where order will have to be imposed. I used to live in one of them. I lived in Baltimore for a long time. You could make Baltimore better, but it means abandoning all these ridiculous abstract ideas about equality and openness and all, democracy and all the other junk. No, there should be a dictator who's in charge and runs things with an iron fist. Everyone will be happier as a result of it. But you don't have to do that in Salt Lake City, Utah. You can have whatever kind of government you want there, because the human capital is better. This is just a practical reality. And I think, it kind of gets to one of my other themes, and that is we're experiencing the end of ideology. The last ideology is dying out, American progressivism. So that means all these goofy ideas about democracy and openness and fairness and all this. Now, what's going to matter in the future is practical results. Do we have cheaper food and cheaper energy and safer neighborhoods? Those are things that matter. How we accomplish them, we're not going to get hung up on. And that's a good thing. You see, because other parts of the world are headed down this way. The Chinese, for goodness sakes, have abandoned communism. The Russians abandoned communism. So we have to kind of join the other great powers in being practical and pragmatic. And I think it's possible. I think that may be what we're experiencing now.
So we are fast coming up on time, Z-Man. I really enjoyed this conversation, despite my health issues. Hopefully I wasn't complete dribbling moron. But if people want to find more of you and your work, what's a good way for them to do that?
The easiest way is to go to thezman.com, or you can go to thedissidentwrite.com or thedissidentwriter.com. I got a bunch of different domains, but thezman.com is the easiest one. It has all my stuff there. Post something every day. Have a podcast every Friday. It has links to my pay-per-view site, so you can get additional content, Twitter, Gab accounts, all that junk.
Well, I highly recommend your show. It's one of the few, actually, that I listen to as a matter of course. There are a lot of people who produce content. I do realize the irony in saying that, but very few that I consider worthwhile enough that I listen to whatever you put out. So I highly recommend that. As far as my stuff, right, the Jay Burden Show is available on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. If you want to support us, you can do so with the links down in the description, or you can check out our sponsors, Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching, and then North Appalachian Supply, if you've got any gear needs. Again, Z-Man, I appreciate it. And everyone at home, keep your head up. The light can't last forever. Good night.